Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report coming off of our New Year episode with Geo. Once again, it was always a pleasure to have him on. Certainly, we'll see much more of him in the future. Not that I have anything planned out in particular, but once again, it's just the way things go. And don't worry, that is far from the last time we will speak to our good friend. But we do have quite a bit of regular news stories to get into. Of course, I am Constantine Martelli, joined by GSP as always. And there's some news to cover about Ukraine. Nothing major since the new year
Yeah,
started. There hasn't been. Once again, we're probably looking towards spring, summer once again before we see any real major shifts. And I mean that does depend on what happens with a lot of the external factors. We'll get into some of the Russian assets that they're considering freezing and handing over to Ukraine. Of course, we'll have plenty of news about the Red Sea and the crisis with the Houthis, and just a few other news items here and there. But without further ado, we'll get right into it, and I'll get your first map up here if you want to just go ahead
yeah,
and start explaining the situation of the what we may have missed over the past week. Past week in Ukraine.
yeah. So this image is basically on the Rabotino front, and what you see is a small gain by the Russians, but what you don't see is that red area at the bottom on the bottom half. That was blue or gray zone 2 weeks ago. So in Rabotino, the Ukrainians have lost about 2 to 3 kilometers on a north-south direction and a little bit on an east-west, but admittedly, not much has been going on. It's not that much of an active front. The other thing I noticed in the last 48 hours is this map around Marinka. So the Russians now have expanded outside of Marinka and are working towards Ge- Georgivka, uh, Georgivka, I would pronounce it, but the Ukrainians, I think, pronounce it Heogorivka because they always make the G soft and it turns it into an H. Um, Losses of territory in some of the places of the northern part of Donetsk in this next map um, that the Russians gained in the last few months. Uh, two farmers' fields, and then I have some other maps to show you. Um, in the Avdiivka direction, we see this. So the black areas are areas that the Russians have taken uh, basically in the last few days, and the purple areas are areas that either the geolocation wasn't correct initially from Syriac maps, or particularly the bottom purple one is areas that the Russians have lost in since last week. This is a close up in the Avdiivka front of recent gains in the last 48 hours or so, or maybe even as of today. Um, the Russians are trying to improve their areas. This is the Dake areas southeast of the dump heap. Um, then you can't see it, but this is an area that is close to Avdiivka, in the town of Pervomaisky, and the Russians have basically improved their positions um, a little bit more. The square you saw the day before, they took an area twice as large as this. So they are moving now. Maybe there's some, and of course, in the Kupiansk, the Russians have been totally pushed out of Sinkovka, And I'll get to some things I wanted to say. For a while I've said off and on that the Russians do not commit to any of the big aero offensives that we saw at the beginning of the war. They'll do a little bit and then they'll stop. If they get too much resistance, then the offensive stops. And it's puzzling because particularly in the Kupiansk area, right? Um, this is the area that had hundreds of thousands of troops, and even the Institute for the Study of War published on their Twitter feed that there's another massing there. Um, so what does this mean? I mean, both sides are risk adverse and to some degree because they are both casualty adverse. It could be argued, we often talk about Biden's election that is coming up, but Putin's election is coming up in March. And I think he wants probably the best footing possible. He's cautious to begin with. But a statement that I think is probably more accurate and reflective of the policy of this war by the Russians is that they will not commit to some large offensive unless they think that they will gain territory very rapidly. But if that's not the case, then they won't do it. Um, you know, I have heard some commentators saying that oh, but while I'm talking, I'll show you areas that the Russians recently gained around Novomihailovka. Um, I don't have the latest picture. Oh, here's one. Yeah, this is more accurate. This is a town south of Marinka and north of Ugledar. So there, of course, this is all in the Donetsk People's Republic. Um, what I'm getting at is, I think, you know, both sides obviously feel like their public can only take so many losses, and it is kind of a modern phenomenon that, like, uh, you could take Israel, Britain, America, all of them post World War II are very adverse to huge losses. And I would say also that the extraordinary losses that the Russians suffered under the Soviet Union and their war of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, has made them cautious about committing to very large offensives that would lack surprise and would probably have huge costs. But
I do think, just on that note, just in the age of instant communications with the internet technology that we have today,
yes,
massive movements like that are made nearly impossible. Number one, because the casualty numbers that would incur, and you're going to get those casualty reports a lot sooner. You're going to get a lot grittier and gorier footage of those casualties. And number two, just when it comes to drone satellite surveillance, it's a lot easier to spot those on a map,
hmm
which negates them even just from a strategic standpoint. So while you can really say never, so to speak, but it seems for the time, for what we're dealing with, those kind of movements are a thing of the past. Now, I mean, I suppose we would have said a conventional war was before this war broke out, but just given the circumstances, it is one of those things that is seemingly going to have to adapt, where that is going to be put in the past. Maybe not entirely, but it does seem,
hmm
just largely because of the circumstance at hand, it is almost impossible to conduct an offensive like that in this day and age.
yeah. I mean, a clear-cut example would be back in October 10th of last year when the Russians decided to send somewhere between 18 to 25, at least that's what most people counted, armored vehicles to assault the northern sector of Devka, right? Now, apparently, there were 30 vehicles. Many of them were damaged or destroyed. Many were abandoned, and some retreated. And what puzzled like me and a lot of people was there was no second or third wave. So a lot of the guys who did manage to gain territory, and remember, the Russians actually went further than Stepova. So, but they didn't get any. There was no second or third wave. Um, and this is what I mean about the Russians are not willing to commit the way you would think they would need to commit, right? And in this image that I'm going to send you now, you get an idea of like the territory that they've only been able to hold on to. This is Stepova that I was talking about, but they went even further than Stepova. Um, and this is from January the 1st. So you can see that they've crossed the railroad tracks, but it's for 11 days, it's been very hard for them to move even further, or they just won't. So I find that interesting, right? Essentially, this means that um, we're not going to see anything change. Now, there were articles in the Western press and the Kiev Post since our last show that mentioned um, attacks by the Russians in Ukraine's deep sectors has had a significant effect on the ability of the Ukrainians to launch offensives in the first place. Remember that on January the 2nd and the 3rd, the Russians had a massive missile strike well, there was 3 nights altogether, but it went roughly from the 2nd to the 4th of January. And um, two of the notable things that they did is a few of them, let's say the city Kharkov, they took out a place that either repaired or built tanks. I would say they probably more or less repaired. I don't know what kind of abilities they have to manufacture this stuff, but maybe they did. The other is there was a kind of a modern hotel, looked to me about 30, 40 stories high. That was taken out, and the photos did surface of not only the damage, but before it was damaged, and there were mercs there. And then a few days ago, another hotel was destroyed. This one had a kind of an old-fashioned, kind of Central European look to it. Much smaller building, much shorter, 3 stories. So there is. So I guess the strategy that the Russians are going for is like lose the least amount of men and hope that the Ukrainians give up. And a lot of things there I think are going to come to a head. And that is we spoke on the show last time that we should probably expect on February 24th that America and the West are going to say they have frozen the funds of the Russians, right? It'll be auspicious because that'll be 2 years on the day that the Russians launched the SMO. And, that will have a kind of a symbolic quality to it. And of course, this will free up $300 billion that they will use to fund the war. Currently, of course, there are many articles that we've seen in the last 2 weeks in particular that Ukraine's ability to round up men is very difficult.
Well, on that same note, I did want to mention with
Mm.
the assets, which I do believe, and maybe it will be February 24th, just so they can hammer in the symbolism because they always love to do that. They love to have these big shows of even soft power, as it were. But I do have to wonder, given the way aid has been distributed to Ukraine as it is, how much of that 300 billion will actually be used towards the war effort and not lining Zelensky or some other oligarch's pockets. And I do think those are things you have to consider because of how the way this war has been conducted so far. And as you were mentioning, just the sheer inefficiency of the conscription system And I actually do. I'll need to dig it up, but I do have saved a list of new ways Ukrainian men have found to dodge conscription just in the past few months. But
Hmm.
yeah, you bring up a good point with the fact that sure they may have $300 billion towards the war effort, but just given the manpower and basic organization, how much good will it do them? Not to downplay the significance of an event like that and the escalation it would be when it comes to West Russia relations. Just on that note, just we're talking $300 billion of Russian assets. It's it's going to bring a lot of things to the surface, and that will be not necessarily good or exciting, but interesting to see.
Yes, yes. Uh, you know, uh, I'm going to show you a map. The only caveat, I've heard some people discussing this, and I'm going to send you a map of a cold front that is supposed to hit Russia and Ukraine this weekend, or it might already have started, and there's supposed to be a lot of snow. Temperatures are going to dip to -10, and again, this is remember the Russians never said that they're going to launch any offensive last year in the winter, right? And yet everybody said that the Russians announced it, or they thought they could read the Russians, and that there was a winter offensive in the works. But I'm hearing that again, and basically what they're speculating is temperatures this year are colder than they were last year, except for a warm spell that they've had for about 2 weeks now, and things should get much colder yet again. So I don't know. This is definitely one of those let's wait and see. But if that's the case, we're recording here on Friday the 12th. So 15th, 16th of on the Monday or the Tuesday. Uh, maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's just people, falling for, the same kind of impetus to see the war speed up. Because I think a lot of people do want to see an end to the war. That's for sure. And strategically, you have to think like, how is Putin going to go about this? How confident is he? Can he afford to be? Like, I discussed in 2022 that he wants to conduct the war in a way that the Russian public doesn't even notice that there is a war going on. And then there were those articles in the New York Times where they basically said what I said 3 months later. However, you know, uh, the longer a war goes on, the less uh, the less you have of this luxury, because even if even if deaths on a daily basis are a fraction of what they were in World War II, and off air we were discussing this very same topic, and you brought up the Iraq-Iran war, which had much higher casualties, and that war went on for 8 years. So you know, I don't know. I think we should. The possibility of this war dragging on for years is very high. And I said it last year, and I'm going to say it again. And here's a little bit of interesting news that we were also talking about with the Wall Street Journal. Remember how I was saying that you shouldn't believe like these stories about the Ukrainians are outgunned 1-5, 1-7. There's lots of anecdotal evidence where the Russians, with their Lancets, take out a Krab, an M109, a French Caesar, and of course there were articles complaining that the Caesar is too big, it's too visible, and so on and so forth. Um, but what this graph shows you is that for the summer offensive, which lasted just a little over 4 months. The Ukrainians managed to outshoot the Russians 4-5, roughly speaking. I mean, now they're apparently the Russians are out shooting them 10-1. How true is this? Right? Like, you could credit Zelensky. Like, on the one hand, you could fault Zelensky, for instance, that, and he wasn't the only one. Siersky was behind him as well. This idea that the summer offensive should also include taking back Bakhmut, which honestly was literally one of the stupidest things I ever heard. Like, that was a waste. I think I can say confidently that if they had not done that, they might have reached Tokmak. I don't know, but maybe there would have been more success. Maybe they would have archered the Russians more. Whatever. I can't imagine that they would be less successful if they had not done that. That said, it appears that Zelensky had managed some way um, to avert an outcome that would have had Ukraine losing even more men. And this is, I think, reflected by Russia's cautiousness and casualty adversity, and why they will not mount any serious offensive. Um, so, just some things to think about. The other news, Battlefront news, the Russians have developed, or the Iranians have given them a new Shahid, or Get on 2, that is jet powered. Of course, there's lots of stories now of the Koreans giving them short range ballistic missiles. The Russians have lots of ballistic missiles, but not many short ranged. Um, you could say that Russia, in some ways, has theoretically, from one president to the other, from the Soviet Union onto the Russian Federation, has prepared for a war like this. Obviously, not every detail, because not everything is known about every war before it happens. Um, so I think we will have to see uh, what the calculus will be for Ukraine and Ukraine's funding come February. Now, Zelensky went on a Baltic tour. He went to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to get support. I believe he got 2.5 billion because Rishi Sunak visited Kiev today, and uh, while he was visiting Kalas in Estonia, he put on a T-shirt with a longitudinal and latitudinal coordinate on his T-shirt that the Estonians had given him, and apparently that represents the very center of Ukraine. This is supposed to imply, I don't know how, but it's supposed to imply that only the borders from 1991 are acceptable, and that's it. There's just no negotiation possible. So that was a very interesting thing. And then he had an interview where he said, we don't have money. We have 12 million pensioners, which is about half the country at this point, and we don't have ways to feed them, and many of them will starve or die. He implied. So it was kind of a crazy visit where he says his usual, like, completely insane stuff, but that's really to just pull at the heartstrings, right? Um, that's what it's for.
Oh, absolutely. Zelensky's entire role in this war has not even been that of leadership. It has been more or less seeking sponsorship when he
Yes.
goes to the West, when he goes to even the so-called peace summit in Saudi Arabia that just so happened to exclude Russia. It has been driving for funds and driving for arms. And that has been what he has done. The main description of his job since February 2022 has been going abroad and seeking aid and spreading the cause of the Ukraine war, while actual men like Zelensky are probably not only leading the war effort, but also the administration of the country on top of that as well. Because I don't believe that Zelensky is involved in day-to-day affairs of state in the way that, say, Putin was, or even a more
Mm.
one-to-one example in somebody whose country was actually embroiled in war, that Assad was, because I believe he was a much more hands-on leader when it came to not only the military affairs, but the day-to-day affairs that it just takes being the head of country. Zelensky, as shown by his at least public schedule travel, I do not believe has been able to actually attend to those. And as for the statistics about whether or not Russia outguns Ukraine and the Ukrainian fire rates during the counteroffensive and the amount of shells produced, one thing you also have to consider plays right back into Zelensky's primary role is Ukraine has a vested interest in downplaying their stockpiles for two reasons. Number one is to, of course, throw the Russians off. They want the Russians to think that
Yes.
uh, the Ukrainians are less prepared, so the Russians might make a bit of an overly ambitious move that the Ukrainians can capitalize. Number two, to garner more aid from the West, because if you have these dire numbers, if you have these ammunition production numbers, if you have these numbers that you lack sufficient tanks to go on a counteroffensive or conduct whatever the pertinent operation is, that is going to be, of course, a call for help to the sponsors, whether it be the US, UK, Germany, France, etc., seeing the provision of weapons there as well. And this is something that will probably continue no matter how much aid Ukraine gets. For all we know,
Yeah.
they could be sitting on everything that they need to that is conducive to their current strategy in this war. And naturally they will still be demanding more because either they want that stockpile, they want to capitalize on the advantage, or there is personal vested interest of people who want to misuse this aid. In which case, it is both when you get down to brass tacks, when you get down to how much is unaccounted for, and just the situation in general. That Ukraine will never have enough. And once again, they've concocted the perfect narrative that we're so close to victory if you just give us
Hmm.
this little bit of help. And
Yes.
that's what they've been saying since the beginning of this war. It's
Right.
not that
And we're so close to collapse that if you don't give us this, we'll collapse. And if you
yes,
don't give us this, we won't. We'll win in 3 months. Like it's always the extraordinary outcomes. Extraordinary outcomes. They're just around the corner. Some negative, some positive. But it can only be. It can. Only you can determine what will happen. It really is a TV show.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. This feels like something out of it. It feels like something out of an ad that, oh, please send your support, particularly with some of these sham quote unquote charities that you see, which I think is a very apt example for Ukraine actually, where it's if you put in your aid today or these investment scams with your small investment today, it'll pay dividends for years to come in the future. And once again, you listen to Zelensky's rhetoric, you listen to the rhetoric of his shills, of his underlings. That is exactly what we've been told since before this war broke out. Look, we're fighting the Russians for you. You outright have politicians get up on the debate stage and say, well, isn't it great that the Ukrainians are doing the legwork of killing the Russians for us? While also never explaining the exact reason
Why are
why
you?
that
Why do
needs
you want to kill the
it,
Russians? What is?
it once again it brings up a question, and of course once again we can get into the nuances of American Russian relations and why they look like they do at a later point. We've certainly gotten that before, but it's not really relevant to the topic at hand. But it reeks again of just somebody who is a scam artist. And you look at Zelensky's background, smarmy actor, nothing really of note except the one Servant of the People TV show where he conspicuously played the role of a populist president who just turns everything around in his beloved country. That's I don't know how much any of you believe in the predictive programming stuff, but if there was ever to be a case made for it, I think it would be right there. Not that I necessarily believe in it, but the entire country is theatrics, and I suppose you could say that about a lot of countries, but it's at the point where the only thing keeping this country alive is the theatrics of its leadership, Zelensky in particular, which is why I think he's actually so vital, and why he hasn't been thrown under the bus yet or removed from power. And I think even the factions of Ukraine who are pro-war and anti-Zelensky keep him around because they know that as much as they may hate him, especially at this point, he's become such a vital cog in the machine of the war effort when it comes to going abroad and getting aid. Now, I suppose the ideal situation for those people is Zelensky goes around on the world tour perpetually while men like Zelensky run the war in the country, but of course that's not happening as well. And it does create a little bit of a stalemate when it comes to the power struggle in Ukraine because with the structure of the country and the structure of the war right now, neither one can afford to be without the other, and there's also no ready substitute for the other. Zelensky can't easily replace Zelensky or vice versa. There's really no supplement for either one, which really does put them in a very codependent relationship. They're very interdependent with each other when it comes to this entire uh, war effort for at least what is left of Ukraine. And going back to his his theatrics with the Estonians that you had brought up, the idea that the peace terms are still Russia concedes everything to the 1991 border, I don't know how they plan to accomplish that. And perhaps that could all just be rhetoric, that could all just be bluster. Maybe there are backdoor negotiations going on right now for all we know. I doubt it, just given the state of the war and given
Hmm.
the incentives that the Russians have. Because to touch on the Russians, we're talking about Putin's election. Now, I know he's a shoo-in by legitimate means or otherwise. I mean, not that I think he's so unpopular that in a fair election he would lose, but of course he's going to he's going to pad out his victory a little, and who can blame the guy in a country that he's in? But
Yeah, I mean, what he doesn't want is obviously there will probably be protests. Obviously, there'll be the Americans, will probably activate um, various apparatchiks inside Russia just before the election, right?
oh, of course,
Now we saw a bit of that in Belgrade. That was very spurious. There was one day where they had a really significant crowd, but that blew over, and it's done. Interestingly, one of the organizers for that in a video conference call happened to have the flag of the Serbian fascists, the few that did side with Hitler in World War II, right? So you see this over and over again. Countries that sided with Hitler are on the side of the rainbow dildo empire,
just
right?
grasping on to whatever
Oh,
sponsors they can still find. These movements that are practically dead. Once again, we're talking about when it comes to Serbia during World War II, the ones who either weren't partisans or Chetniks, the ones who were outright collaborationists with the
yeah, yeah,
Germans, so
yeah.
few
These
and
these
far
weren't even
between,
Chetniks.
so few and far between that this man just so happens to conspicuously have this flag, and of course, it fits under the umbrella of all of these groups, all of these nationalities that really feel the need to still prove themselves by clinging on to whatever collaborationist movement they had with the SS because that's I guess that's the best they ever performed in a war. That's the most significance they've ever had in their history. I mean, when we talk about some of these countries, that it might actually be the case. Not to
Hmm.
downplay them too much, but it is just that clinging on to a bitterness and, and at that point, it's not even ideologically in line with, say, uh, whatever those fascist movements during World War II. It's just clinging on to the bitterness and resentment of them and capitalizing upon their symbology. I mean, looking at a lot of these Ukrainians, beyond their blithering hatred for the Russians, what do they really have in common with Bandera? Once again, it's just such a. I would argue it's even worse because after a certain point, it just becomes superficial. Everything else is subjugated to just this blind, irrational hatred of Russia. Not even a dislike, not even a criticism, but once again, this blind, irrational hatred that they cannot see anything beyond that. That is the first principle
Yeah.
from which all others come from whenever they talk about anything to do with their nation, with their politics, anything along those lines. But I do like that you brought up the fact that what is left of the American assets in Russia will be activated before, during, and after this election cycle. And that Putin, of course, even though he's a shoo-in, even though there's no real contest, he wants to go into this with as much strength as he can garner. So if the front in Ukraine looks good, that's great. If the Russian economy is up, in which case it is, that's also great. But he wants to have everything in his favor that he can going into this because although it should be a very non-eventful day, if we're just
Mm.
talking in a standard sense, there are those out there who will want to make this an actual contest. Those out there who will want to make this a day of controversy and try to really recreate what Russia saw in 2011 and 2012 when Putin returned to office after Medvedev was in power for his 2 terms.
Hmm.
And because those are to my understanding, in the Putin era, the largest anti-government protests to this date. I know there were some flare-ups in the eastern fringes of Russia in 2020, 2021 related to the various issues there. There were some problems from the eastern governors. Putin had one of them removed, and he was more in line with the. I think he was more in line with the LDPR. Can't quite remember exactly, but there was some minor controversy there. But I do really think that they want to create that instability that Putin felt in 2011, 2012, when it probably out of every protest movement against him, that one was the most likely to actually see him
Hmm.
removed from power and most likely to
Hmm.
see him a proper color revolution in Russia. Now, I don't think they'll succeed, but they want to put that pressure there. They want to be able to show that to the media. Crowds of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, have marched out in the streets of every major city in Russia to protest against Putin's tyrannical regime. Look, everyone is secretly American on the inside, and they're just protesting. They're just dying to get out. They just want to join our global, liberal, democratic, LGBTQ CIA world order. And you see, it's in the hearts of all of us. It just needs to be awakened by the right force. Of course, that's the
Hmm.
narrative they want to go into this. That's the narrative that they want to paint. I don't think it's going to be very successful. I mean, I'm not going to downplay what happened in Serbia, but to this point seemed to have completely fizzled out, at least from what I've seen. That it didn't really.
Yeah, I've seen nothing.
No, it
Honestly, it's been 2 weeks and there's just
oh
nothing.
yeah,
And if there was, we'd hear it.
yeah, complete flash in the pan. And I'm not saying that Vucic's political career is saved because of all the other issues that face him as a politician and Serbia in general, just with the direction the country's going, with the situation in Kosovo, with the European Union, the situation in Bosnia, among others. Once again, that's not
Hmm.
to completely say that he's out of the he's out of it yet. He's out of the woods yet, but compared to the position he was in 2 weeks ago, those were a complete flash in the pan. Nothing really came of those. And I suspect that a similar thing will happen in Russia in March of this year. We're talking about 2 months from now. It will be the first round of the Russian elections. And, I mean, I think it would be interesting to see the results of this if there is a stronger showing from the right of Putin. We're talking about the LDPR, and I don't know who's actually in the leadership position post Zhirinovsky, but I know that they are still framing themselves as the more right wing alternative to Putin, despite being largely in concordance with United Russia when it comes to any real governing issues. It does seem that United Russia, the communists, and
There's an avowed
yeah.
Freemason who has also thrown his hat into the race.
Oh, wonderful. Who certainly he's got in the bag. He's got the global Masonic infrastructure behind him. So how could
Yeah.
he possibly? But once again, I thought Putin was Freemason. I thought he was. I
He might
thought.
be digging tunnels,
Oh no, I can't. That's
under the Kremlin. You
that
just
that
don't know.
is that is verboten. I don't like the sound of that. Who would ever do such a thing? Is what I find myself asking. Uh, but once again, I will be curious, and if I were to expect any sort of pushback against Putin, in the polls at least, not necessarily in the streets, but in the polls, is I would expect maybe a right wing contingent that thinks that he is too moderate on this war, that thinks he's too moderate on the current issues at hand. And
Right.
I'm not saying that's going to be a major force, but I think out of all the forces opposing Putin, at least what's going to show up in the election, it's probably going to come from that.
Yeah, I mean, I finished discussing how, there's after some activity, after some gains for 3 weeks or so, the Russians have, and mind you, none of them were like massive gains. They basically ate up what Ukraine had gained in this summer and fall, right? Um, and people can check out the show that we did. Although I know there were some people that were very upset that I did so many maps. I don't blame them, but in any case, you can find out like what had been going on for several weeks and months. But nothing astronomical. Like like I say, they have the forces to do it, but they won't do it. Um, Maybe as we gain more experience with this war, we can find out why. Maybe, like I said earlier about, artillery, right? Ukraine managed for 4 or 5 months to have more artillery than the Russians, right? Um, I don't hear anything from the Russians saying that's not true. The Russians have always said that they had more. And then you have all these commentators that, they do the math based on how many cannons they have and so on and so on. Of course, Russia has thousands of cannons, but they're not going to use them because, well, they want to recycle them because how many shells do you have? Do you have enough shells for all those pieces? Just something to think about. But I think it ties into what you're saying. What I said earlier. I think the 2 points su- uh, support each other very well.
No, that's yeah.
The slow grind, and then the election coming up, and but people will want. I think, like I say, it was easier. I think in the first year and a half to create a situation where is there even a war going on to like because that in a way gets them back to a kind of complacency. The issue is how much do we really want this part of Ukraine that was traditionally Russian? Like, how worth it is it? The people living there who voted for it, how adamant are they about it? How adamant are the Ukrainians about taking this back? Right? Because Time Magazine and the New York Times had an article about how they're saying we're exhausted. Um, that was one of the lines that they quoted, through the piece. The fighting is not eased, and Russian forces are now on the offensive. The Russians were employing subterfuge as well. Planchette said, playing tapes of gunfire on drones to make Ukrainian soldiers think they were under attack, leave the bunkers, and reveal their positions. Anyways, they talk about this kind of tear gas that the Russians are using to ferret them out. And then Time Magazine had scenarios about what could happen. Time Magazine named Divided Ukraine among the main risks of 2024. 10 most important risks for the year, in which point number 3 is called Divided Ukraine. Quote, this year, Ukraine will remain de facto divided, and now Russia has the initiative on the battlefield and a material advantage, experts write. 2024 is a turning point in the conflict. If Ukraine does not soon solve its problems with personnel, does not increase weapons production, and does not develop a realistic military strategy, its territorial losses may be permanent and possibly expand. Kiev has been hit hard by waning political and material support from the United States, and the prospects for European assistance are only slightly better. Ukraine desperately needs more troops. Notice how they keep going on and on about troops. Now, um, there's all kinds of estimates, some from the Russians, some from the West, and some even from Ukraine, that they say that there are roughly 650 to 850,000 Ukrainian troops right now on the battlefield. Of course, the Ukrainians have said that there are actually only 485,000 Russian troops that are engaged in the conflict. That's a new one, but I found that was interesting. Previously, you had various sources saying that the Russians also had around 6.5, 650,000 troops, roughly speaking. So I thought that was interesting. Now, the attacks on Crimea, they wane and they ebb and wane and so on and so forth, but not very successful. the thing is that the Russians are attacking their infrastructure, and I, again, I think that the Russians want to create this atmosphere that there's no war going on, but there that can only go on for so long. So, if there is going to be a major counteroffensive from the Russians, probably it would happen, knowing Putin, probably it would happen after he wins the election, and the Rasputitsa in the spring uh, ends, because they actually have even more rain in the spring than they do in the fall. So, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do have to say, with that, I there's not really much I can add. I do think you're right, and I do think that particularly this year, the Russians are going to have to be very careful in picking the times in which they were to launch any potential offensives or any potential major military
Hmm.
operations, both to their advantage and to their disadvantage, depending mostly actually on Western political trends, especially the upcoming U.S. election. Because if they can do it under the nose of the Americans who are more focused on domestic politics or other issues, or if they can do it at a time in particular to, say, humiliate Biden
Hmm.
while
Hmm.
he's running for office. For, just to pick a shot in the dark example, for example, if the Russians launch a major offensive during the Democratic National Convention. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, nor am I saying that would really have any sort of impact, but just for the sake of an example, perhaps that would lead to some sort of delegitimization of Biden in the eyes of both the American public and on the world stage. The fact that while he is muttering incoherently at his acceptance speech for the nomination, you have Russia crushing Ukrainian positions, just hypothetically speaking. Or once again, actually, as we actually get closer to the election, or perhaps Trump will call in his October surprise from Putin, because they're in such a tight collaboration where Russia will launch some sort of major offensive in October. The point being is, just based on the various political trends within the U.S., you could actually ex- I wouldn't say expect, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that the Russians would plan their moves around those to either have some sort of sway on public opinion in the U.S. or some sort of what's more likely sway on public opinion in the world. While the Americans are so internally focused, the Russians are making gains in every tangible sense, and that could also expand to other sectors. I mean, Putin has just in the past year made major diplomatic strides with a number of different countries, a number of different power blocs. He could have a very successful meeting abroad with, say, Xi Jinping or uh, any of the leaders of the Arab states, especially in light of the current Arab conflict, or hell, maybe even Lula in Brazil. But once again, there's a number of possibilities here. Could make some sort of major diplomatic strides while the U.S. is bickering over internal politics. And so there's a lot of options that could be done here. There's a lot that could be played to it. The Russians also have the advantage of their election being much earlier in the year, so that'll be out of the way after March, after Putin will, with 99% certainty, secure re-election. And it, it's going to be much to Russia's advantage while we have this, because
Hmm.
2016, once again, everyone accepted just the reality that the Americans were hegemonic. There was really no challenging them beyond a few actions in Ukraine and Syria, say 2015, 2016. 2020, it was a bit more on the fence. China had a hell of a year itself in 2020, but ultimately managed to come out on top of it all. And just the domestic situation in the U.S. with the lockdowns, with the riots, with the worsening economy, even though they came more so after 2020, but the lockdowns certainly did put a number on the economy and just social trends in general within the U.S. That called into question then just the debacle of the election outcome in 2020 as well. Did a lot to delegitimize America on both the world stage and at home. So we could see a repeat of that in 2024 in a much more escalated manner, because we've already crossed those bridges. So we're only going further down this road, and it's probably only going to escalate more. And that's not only for the Russians, but for the Chinese. You could have Xi Jinping make very significant moves in light of American political realities and American geopolitical realities. And if the signals point that, hey, it might look like Trump's coming back into power, we could see a reorientation of the way business is conducted, both on the battlefield and off the battlefield in the case of Russia, or just in general in the case of China. Them adapting their strategies to deal with a potential new American administration, especially after November, December, when we actually know who's going to be coming into office in November. For all we know, Biden has some health emergency and either croaks from it or is unable to stand for re-election because of it, and he's replaced with Kamala. Not that that would be much better, or in fact, I think it would be worse. Or maybe they pull somebody like Gavin Newsom, who is a younger, relatively charismatic white guy who can still speak to the average American while pushing all the nonsense that they still want. Or number of possibilities we could be dealing with here. Trump could get indicted. Trump could face actual legal penalties for whatever actions he may or may not have committed. So there's so many things that could be played on domestic politics, and as it looks like the administration either stays the same or changes, even if it is another Democrat coming to power in that scenario, which I wouldn't say
Hmm.
is likely, but it's significant enough to discuss the possibility. I'll put it that way. We could see a response to that just all over the world stage because despite the decline in American power, they are still the top power in the world. I wouldn't say they're hegemonic at this point just because of everything that has
Yeah.
happened in the past 2 years, but out of the to use an overused term, out of the multipolar world we live in, they are still the most powerful pole for the time being. Now, that could drastically change even overnight, just with the way things have been going.
I
Perhaps
was
not.
saying combined arms is true,
Yes, certainly.
but the latest statistics are that they're like again for the third year in a row they have not been able to meet their recruitment numbers, and now only 44% of of people who joined the army are white.
Yes, I did see those as well, but I'm talking more in the broad sense of
Yeah,
American soft,
nuclear
hard economic
missiles,
power.
cruise missiles, yes,
Yeah,
economic, yeah.
everything under one umbrella, despite the fact that it is declining, and I do believe it will continue to decline. America is still at the number one spot, even though it does face actual viable challengers when perhaps 5 or 6 years ago we couldn't have said that.
Hmm. The other thing that I saw that made me think, what would like I'm going to bring back the conversation just momentarily to the question of manpower, because it seems to be like I see clips from Ukrainian television. Of course, we discussed how lots of various Western press periodicals, from Political, MSNBC. Like, I mean, they're all talking about men's shortage, right? Like we're and even this crazy, crazy guy, Alexei Goncharenko. This guy is a Rada member, and this is what he proposed this year: that children of a suitable age begin working in the factories, and that all men and women are drafted for the war effort. And he says this quite plainly. He said, "We did it in World War II. I don't see any reason why we can't do it again." It, it's it's just mind-boggling. Now, what would happen if, the seizing of the funds happens February 2024, the election in Russia is just a few weeks after that? It's going to sour the election, let's say, in the minds of Westerners, it will sour the election. The Russians are well past this whole seizing, the seizing of their funds. They've already seized some Western assets. They're just going to seize more as well in
Oh
retaliation.
yeah, to think that they don't have a contingency plan for this,
Yeah, yeah.
even the most rabid of anti-Russia commentators would be should be ashamed of believing that the Russians wouldn't have some sort of contingency response plan waiting in the wings.
Right, but this injection, let's say they manage to put all of it toward Ukraine, that there's no um that there is corruption doesn't siphon off the important military material that is supposed to get to the Ukrainian forces. The New York Times had an article where they said they cannot account for 39,139 weapons supplied to Ukraine. Now, just since June, okay, since June of 2022, the Ukrainians received 10,000 Javelin ATGMs, 2,500 Stinger manpads, and 750 kamikaze drone switchblades, and 430 mid-range air missiles, so on and so on. But even that they're running out of. But what would happen to the morale of the Ukrainians if this money was like they sell off the assets, the money, like for the first time ever, the Ukrainians decide not to be corrupt. Well, I mean, it's their they have a kosher mafia basically, and a lot of other people beneath them that siphon this stuff off. It goes right down to a recruitment officer to somebody even in the SBU. Let's be honest, right? It's systemic. It's not even just one class. But let's suppose that news is announced. Did the recruitment numbers go up? To the will the population wait for results? How soon can the weapons arrive? Do they have the same amount of weapons even if they had the money, right? I mean, we could get into Ecuador later, but Ecuador gave them something like $250 million worth of like old Soviet parts, not even running vehicles, but parts, vehicles that could be cannibalized for other vehicles that have been damaged. I don't know. That's just something I think about. Is there a real man shortage in Ukraine? I mean, on numbers, no. On recruitment, planning for the future, it sounds like there is.
Yeah, I would fundamentally agree with that when it comes to that, and I think that's been the problem that they've run into since the beginning of the war. It's not necessarily been a lack of manpower in the raw sense, in terms of they don't have the bodies to put there, but in terms of even being able to conscript these men, they have struggled greatly. And the recent figure I saw is that there has been a spike in divorce cases in Ukraine where the father keeps custody because that is a way to have his conscription deferred. Whereas these couples aren't even breaking up; it's just that they are legally ending the marriage,
Hmm.
and the mother is surrendering custody in order to give the father some degree of immunity. Now, how long until they do away with that? It's a matter of time, and they've done this consistently, where they've peeled back draft deferrals on students, on people who maybe didn't quite meet the medical standards the first time, and they will continue to do this until they need bodies. Now, the
Yeah.
Ukrainian Ministry of Defense allegedly said, I couldn't find a solid source for this, but it's believable enough, so I will say it, allegedly put in the order for 50,000 uniforms for women. And going
Yes.
back to the idea that most likely, even if in non-combat roles, they will begin the conscription of women. Like I said, even if they do that for auxiliary roles, because that opens up more men to be put in the front lines
That's
with
right.
improper training and equipment, mind you, in order to hold whatever is left here. And in terms of realistically what the Ukrainians can do to sustain this war effort, I wouldn't be able to see if we're talking honestly, if the Ukrainian leadership is honest with itself and is able to make these tough calls,
Hmm.
I don't see how they can sustain anything that isn't a massive retreat into a far more defensive position. Perhaps to the most extreme, everything west of the Dnieper is what they would have to give up in order to build the defensive position. Perhaps that may be a bit of an
Hmm.
extreme case, but
Hmm.
once again, just to give you an example, because otherwise it's just been a slow grinding
Yeah.
away against the Russians, and the amount of resources they threw away in the counteroffensive when they could have been once again digging their heels in, preparing for
Yeah.
a harsher Russian response that inevitably was going to come, that I think everyone knew was going to happen at some point. The fact that the smaller nation under attack is trying to wage an offensive war, which it has been seemingly since the summer of 2022, it does not follow at all, and it really just shows that this war is being commanded and planned by people who view the soldiers as nothing more than the first wave against the Russians. And that is all the war in Ukraine has ever been to the
Hmm.
NATO generals who have run this war since day one. It has been, look, we anticipate that we will have to fight the Russians at some point, but if the Ukrainians can mow down a few tens, if not
Yeah,
hundreds of thousands of Russians, if they can waste however many billions of dollars in equipment of the Russians, that's a good head start for us, and we'll take it. So
yeah.
that's
I think the Russians also suspect that, and
oh, absolutely, and that's why they've played
yeah.
this war so cautiously, because I think they knew full well going into this, and the several other times that they were baited, that this was meant fully to be a trap for them. This was meant fully for them to step in the proverbial bear trap, and
Hmm.
it, arguably, to a degree, they did. I wouldn't go that far.
Hmm.
But they knew that trap was there, but they also knew they were in a position where they couldn't afford not to react given the escalation in the Donbass and given
Yes.
what had happened in the Donbass. So it has been a very careful war effort. And while the
Hmm.
casualties have been higher than anything we've seen in decades, they have been relatively low considering what they could have been.
Wars in the
Yeah.
past have been.
And
Yeah.
once again, that goes back to, I think, just the instantaneous communication technology that we have, that people are less likely to tolerate that when they get instant news of mass casualty events. On top of surveillance technology makes it much harder to plan the so-called big arrow offensives, where while they still do happen to a degree, the ability to do them is greatly diminished because of how good the satellites, the drone technology, the surveillance technology, all of it is.
Yeah.
But fighting this war in a slow burn may have made the Russians look weaker for a time, and may have even cost them some credibility,
Yeah. Yeah.
both at
But
home and abroad.
it's also
But in
emptied
the
out
long
NATO.
term, yes, in the long term,
Yeah.
it has played to their advantage,
Yeah.
because they've effectively demilitarized Europe. The Europeans are actually having to tap into their active arms stockpiles to support the Ukrainians. The U.S. hasn't had to do so yet, but it's not inconceivable
They
that
will.
they will at some point. I
Yeah.
mean, they've had to bribe and coerce these second and third world nations to hand over their arms stockpiles. There were negotiations with Venezuela to try to get them to either, I think Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, these countries that formed the Latin American axis of evil that they've been harping on about for so long. They were in backdoor negotiations to buy arms from them to send to Ukraine. We've
Uh,
tried to strip arms from South Korea to send to Ukraine, which is funny because the Russians have done the same thing with North Korea, been buying surplus from North Korea.
the two Koreas.
It really is a Korean proxy war. That's what they don't want you to know. But it's been a desperate search for arms, considering the fact that once again the light stockpiles the Europeans maintained have been, are been, and will be diminished because of just how light they were, with how the security structure of NATO was, the full reliance on the Americans to provide that security umbrella, and once again, even the behemoth that is the American military, with how much our industry has been furloughed, it has not been able to keep up those production numbers. Sure, once again, the Ukrainians had a, a decent showing for what they were in the beginning of this war, but now that time has set in, you're starting to see that attrition that the Russians have been playing since day one really start to set in. The longer this war goes on, without any sort of major stimulus to Ukraine, whether that be in the form of the aid package, whether that be in the form of the seized assets, it's going to continue to go this direction. And Ukraine will continue to leave more and more of a sour taste in the mouths of Westerners as living conditions get worse at home, as their power and prestige slips away abroad, and especially combined with the burgeoning Middle Eastern crisis that we're looking at right now,
Yeah.
which we'll get into in a little bit here.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it becomes it becomes an untenable situation, where to the point where, yeah, sure, you can talk about all the problems that Russia may be facing internally and externally, but when it comes to a matter of time, the Russians have much more time on their side. Even
Yeah.
if
I would agree with
yeah,
that.
even if in general, and I'm not saying I personally believe this, but even if in general the Russians don't have time on their side, they have more time on their side than the West does.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I wanted to say that that sparked for me. While you were talking, um, one is, we mentioned Serbia. Um, I honestly think that one of the reasons they want to topple Serbia is they want to use more of Serbia's stockpile to donate to Ukraine. Um, the other thing is, just to go back to that article uh, titled "We're Exhausted" from the New York Times, quoting a Ukrainian soldier named Banderas. he assures us it's after Antonio Banderas, not the other Bandera.
Wait,
And he
what other
says,
Bandera?
yeah, he says, "We are short of people," said an intelligence commander of the 117th Brigade, who used the call sign Banderas, supposedly after the actor Banderas. But this is likely a cover story, and he is instead probably named after Stefan Bandera. Both officers and soldiers admitted to the American newspaper that, quote, "the Russian attacks were so intense that operating near the front line has never been so dangerous." Quote, "Soldiers said that since March, they had suffered the additional devastating power of glide bombs, half-ton explosives unleashed from planes that smashed through underground bunkers." So that stuff is working, uh, which makes me wonder, remember how long it took Russia to begin bombing their command centers? Or like, just messing around with their electricity. All of that started after the attack on the Kerch Bridge.
Yeah,
That
it
was
wasn't
it.
until October 2022, after the first Ukrainian counteroffensive, it wasn't until the Kerch bridge strikes, as you said, that they stopped exclusively targeting strategic military sites when it comes to the battlefield. When they started going after NATO command centers, when they started going after energy and electricity infrastructure,
Yeah.
in which case it showed. And if we want to go back on that, it showed that this was a war of integration, that they wanted to leave this as untouched as possible because they wanted less of a cleanup by the time it was done. But they realized that
Yeah.
given the circumstances of the war, this was not a possibility, and it continued to escalate. Now, it's nowhere near what the Israelis have done in Gaza or even in Syria, for that matter. But it, we're seeing a much more encompassing war. It's not total war, but it's a much more encompassing war. And unfortunately, it probably will escalate at that point the longer this does drag on, which that will lead to more escalation, that will lead to more problems on the ground just for everyday people caught on either side of this in Ukraine. So this isn't necessarily something to relish in, but I do think that we have to be honest with ourselves about the direction this is going in. And of course,
Yeah.
once again, NATO, the West, the American Empire, they revel in all of this. They see no difference between these people. They view them as all the same backwards, barbaric people that need to be wiped off the face of the earth, that they couldn't care less for, that they uh, actively disdain as much as they honestly disdain their own population at this point. So,
Hmm.
if a Ukrainian dies fighting the Russians, that's two birds, one stone as far as they're concerned.
Yeah. And you can see the crux of the problem in what those soldiers had said to the New York Times, and that is um, the reach that the Russians have, even if the front lines don't move, the reach over a longer period of time is more devastating for them, which is why they have to um, um, win the war more quickly, so to speak, right? And in the article, he also says, "We have guns, but we don't have enough men." There was also another guy who was interviewed. Um, I don't know if he's in the government or formally part of the Rada, but he said we should be honest with the losses that we've suffered in this war, because he believed that if they were honest with the losses, more people would sign up. He says the truth of the matter is we require 30,000 men per month. And he said this gives you a rough idea of what is happening in this war, right? Um, So I thought that was an interesting admonition that whether we think it's high or low, whether we compare it to this war or that war, they think for them that the losses are large. And this is a rough idea. Now, there was somebody else who said that they needed 20,000 2 weeks before, but 20 to 30,000 a month. All right. You have to ask yourself what is going on. The other bit of news is, there's a German company because the Ukrainians have had a very difficult time repairing their Leopard tanks, particularly the older Leopard 1 tanks, and they're sent off to Lithuania for repairs. And forget the name. It's a very long German name, but they have said that they are going to begin construction of a tank factory. Now, I'm very certain that there are underground tank factories that already exist in Ukraine, you know, um, but which I think for the Russians, they have to think about, do they kill more personnel or do they, like, what's going to run out quicker? If you kill more personnel, the morale of the country could suffer more deeply than if you would obviously want to destroy their ammunition factories, their tank factories, their drone factories, and so on and so on. But um, if you can't reach them, then you don't really have a choice but to go after command centers. And they have lost a lot of officers. They've lost actually more officers than the Russians have. I know the first year that was a really big thing for the West. Um, but that's about all I have for Ukraine.
I suppose the last tangentially related story, actually two stories related to
Hmm.
Ukraine. I'll start with the less interesting, the one that's probably going to be less interesting to people, and that was the brief disappearance of Lloyd Austin while he was
Oh
hospitalized.
yes, I totally forgot
Now,
about that.
this was from, I believe, January 1st to January 5th. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was hospitalized without the knowledge, without at least what they said, the knowledge of Biden or Blinken. Both denied knowing anything about it when questioned. Now, who knows how honest they were being when it comes to that. But coming mainly from Dima of Military Summary, so take that for what you will, depending on how much you would rely on his claims. He speculates that Austin may have been in Ukraine and injured on the ground there, which is not unprecedented given what we've seen in Ukraine before. The one that always comes to mind for me is the Canadian general who disappeared from Mariupol after the city was taken, who was found in Azovstal and never heard from again. And once again, if anyone has an update on his status, I would like to know because I haven't heard anything of that story since Mariupol fell back in, what was that, May 2022. But when it comes to high ranking NATO officers and high ranking Western officials going to Ukraine, it has been a regular occurrence. Now, especially early on in the war, understandably, there was very much a Russian aversion to any strikes related to that area. For example, when Boris Johnson visited Kiev the first time, they were very conscious not to make any strikes that could possibly cause harm to a Western foreign minister for obvious reasons. Now, I am not going to say one way or another if I believe this happened because I simply just don't know enough to say. But given the frequency at which Western officials, both military and civilian, visit Ukraine, it does create a very dangerous situation, especially as Russia does escalate strikes. That let's say if this let's assume this is 100% the case. Lloyd Austin visits Ukraine to advise Zelensky's illusion, etc. Russians let strike. Austin is hit and injured in those strikes. That leaks out to the public. What impact does that have on American Russian relations? Is that what they want to happen? Is that a sacrifice they're willing to make in order to escalate the situation with Russia? Once again, all speculation. You're not saying any of this actually did happen. Or say he would actually be a casualty of strikes. He would actually be killed by these strikes. Would that lead to a state of war between the U.S. and Russia, with a cabinet secretary falling victim to a foreign military while in that combat zone? Would it be something we deny? Would it be something we cover up? And although that didn't happen with this case, I do think it warrants the discussion of this is a very real possibility that we've been looking at since February 2022. And the longer this war continues, the more likely something like this will happen. And the question is, what is going to be the response to that? Is this going to be used as an excuse for escalation? I could see them, if they really wanted to, sending some no named European foreign minister. Let's say, for example, the Dutch or the Danish foreign minister. Not to cast too many aspersions on the Dutch or the Danish, but let's talk about a minor Western European country, or their defense minister, whoever, some cabinet secretary of their country, over to Ukraine to visit and advise Zelensky. Runs launch an airstrike. That Western official is a casualty. Well, there's your Article 5 situation if you ever want it. And that would probably be the easiest way to do it. Just put them as tripwires in that country. Put Western officials as tripwires on their quote unquote diplomatic visits in those countries. Now, that's assuming they would want to escalate the war and wouldn't just sweep it under the rug. But assuming they did want to escalate the war, that's probably the best situation they could use to get, because that's an undeniable case of an active war. Even if the Russians didn't know, they can say, oh, well, they actually did. There's so many ways they can twist this. There are so many opportunities for them to twist this. But I do think that regardless of what happened with Austin, which is probably a lot less exciting or interesting than any of the possibilities being discussed, it it's enough of a possibility to warrant the actual discussion of what the situation is going to look like if or when it actually does happen. And I'm not looking forward to that day, and I hope this war ends long before we get to that point, because that is a situation that could start a global conflict. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic about that, but I do generally believe that is a situation, if the parties acting wanted to, could use to start a global conflict. And look, there's a lot of tripwires they have around Russia that they could use for escalation at any moment they wanted. There's a lot of things they could claim the Russians do. Now, some of those have been thwarted, as we've seen, but eventually they do enough of them, one of them's got to stick, or maybe a few of them stick, in which case they can use this. But I think we're treading very dangerous territory here with that. Whether or not this Austin case is true, and I just wanted to use him as a springboard to bring up this possibility, because as I mentioned before, as you had told me, Dima had brought up that possibility. And while I'm not going to say one way or another, because once again I simply don't know enough about Austin's brief absence, I do fear that this is a play they could make in the near future.
Yeah, about 4 or 5 days ago, there were some Neptune missiles that were launched at Crimea that were intercepted. Some of the other missiles, it's Storm Shadows, right? Um, some of the Russian officers claimed that those missiles were launched from Romania. You know, I know the F-16 thing is a big issue, right? They don't want to see F-16s shot out of the sky. Remember that the British lost two of their best challengers. The Germans lost and continue to lose dozens and dozens of 2A6, 2A4 Leopard tanks. There's well over 50 now that have been destroyed. One was even towed by the Russians. So they don't want that to happen. And remember what I said, that they don't need these Ukrainian pilots. And I know the F-16 um, program has been pushed to the end of 2024, but um, what I see happening is in 2024 they're going to sort of massage the European public of why if Ukrainians fly into Romania and launch their Storm Shadows from Romania, that's okay. If the Russians retaliate and shoot it over Romania, then you have Article 5. I bring it up because, it's another scenario for Article 5, right? So I don't know. That's very worrying, right? They don't need the F-16s to engage in dogfights with the SUs and so on and so on, right? They need them. It's just a platform, right? The Ukrainians now, I think it's kind of obvious they've run out of mostly all of their Su-27s that could carry those missiles. But that's definitely something people should think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's unprecedented. And that was part of my speculation when I thought Poland was actually going to try to get involved in Ukraine. That is something that they would do. They would launch strikes from NATO territory, but any retaliation on NATO territory would be an Article 5 situation, even if it was instigated by a NATO member.
Mm,
In which case, we could very easily see that happen in the future. And it's also been a question of speculation when it comes to the bombing of supply convoys on the part of the Russians that are connected to NATO, even once they're in Ukrainian territory, if that also does constitute a reason for escalation between Russia and Ukraine as well. And if they want to escalate this, they have no shortages of options.
mm,
It's really that simple. And the reason I think they haven't so far is because they know the consequences of that. They know that it will be far more than they could handle, at least at this point, if they do want to bring something like that about. And
mm,
but I
mm,
do fear that there are overly zealous parties within enough positions of power in order to make something like that happen. And I it, it is something that does generally concern me, and I fear the longer this war is allowed to go on, the closer we will come to that, which is why I think that, look, although my biases certainly are on the side of the Russians, as I think anyone who's listened to this program long enough would realize, that I just want to see some sort of conclusion to this war.
mm,
And I
mm,
do think that, just in terms of global security, a pro Russian conclusion would be better because it would soothe over that issues. It would deter NATO from such bold action in the future. But I do fear, once again, the longer this is allowed to go on, the more bold NATO will get, the more desperate they will get, and that they will continue to push this until they get the response that they want. And I'm not even saying NATO as a whole. Like I said, it just takes a few zealous individuals in positions of power in order for this to fester into a situation that is beyond all of our controls.
Yeah, I mean, I said early on last year that um, everything is on the line with this war for both sides, and a year later we see articles that say as much. Nobody in 2022, certainly not writing for Political, the New York Times, Times of London, the Telegraph, the Guardian, Washington Post, would dare say something like, if we stop the war now, NATO is finished, or we will lose our position in the world. But you hear that now, right? And you hear the scaremongering. Sweden is the latest country. Of course, there's been Germany and other countries, Poland, that, if the war stops now, Russia's appetite will not be satiated, and it will expand even further west, right? Other stuff that, like, makes no sense. The Financial Times had an article with, this domino, and it literally said a counterfactual argument or what would happen. They literally tell you it's counterfactual. So, um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. The only thing you can hope for is the U.S. Finds a way that they can maintain their empire, a sizable part of the empire, and that they will still have a lot of influence. But Europe will be scrapped. Some kind of détente between Russia and Europe is reached, and so on and so on. That would they be willing? I mean, it's an incredible loss of prestige, right? And there's still too many. There's still too many boomers, American boomers, that would devastate them. It would be like losing their soul if that happened.
It very
They would
much
die. They would literally die depressed.
it's very much a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation when it comes particularly to the question of Europe and its relationship with Russia, where they can't afford to do either. And I do want to. It's an aside, but I want to bring it up because I found it entertaining, and that is Donald Trump's alleged comments to EU Commissioner Thierry Brenton. So
For real.
Brenton said this was in a private conversation from 2020. So take it for what it is, whether you believe it or not. Trump said NATO is dead, and if Europe comes under attack, the U.S. is not coming to defend it. And Brenton said he quoted that directly from Trump, and he revealed this to the European Parliament uh, in his concern about Trump's return to power and European security. And he called for an internal market and urged self-reliance among geopolitical tensions. And this also comes from a statement from the Italian defense minister renewing calls for a quote-unquote European army. Now, what they're going to
Yes.
arm themselves with, what they're actually going
Yeah.
to use in combat, it seems that has all been expended in Ukraine. But nonetheless, the calls for a so-called European army has returned, and the
Hmm.
talks of quote-unquote European strategic autonomy have returned, and they could have not come at a more of an opportune time. You have 4 years of, let's just call it uneasy peace under Trump. Sure, things aren't the best, but they're certainly not the worst. And the Europeans are fretting and stewing, looking for their out. Biden squeezes every ounce of juice this continent has left in it to support this failing war effort, and Atlanticism has never been stronger. The idea that Trump
Yes.
might come back to power and that the
Oh,
U.S.
he
might
could
lose.
start World War III if he
He could
does.
start World War III by losing interest in the European theater.
Yeah.
The Europeans must galvanize again. Already broken, squeezed dry, lights turned off, complete loss of energy and industry, just exodus from the continent. The fear
Yeah.
mongering about Donald Trump must continue. That is the seriousness of the governments that are aligned with Brussels at this time, and that is what you can expect from them. And even the so-called based quote unquote right wing governments. And once again, let's look at the migration crisis in Italy. And I don't relish in that, certainly not. But this is what your right wing nationalist government gave you. This is the absolute capitulation that they delivered to you after. In many of these countries, just given the social and political climates, you put your neck on the line supporting these people, and this is how they repay you. And I suppose to a large degree, you could say a lot of the same things about Donald Trump, and I wouldn't deny that. But this is the situation time again in the Western world, and the bureaucrats faced with the possibility of having to deal with Trump again, that is worse than anything they could imagine. The only thing that could be worse is Putler subjugating the continent, which is what Trump would deliver to them. And I mean, who are we kidding? Trump would, of course, whether by his own will or otherwise, would be strong armed into supporting Europe if there was ever an Article 5 case. I don't think anyone can
No.
ever deny that. I mean, Trump's response to Ukraine probably would have been maybe not quite as ridiculous as what we see now, but by no means would Trump have cut Ukraine off. Absolutely not. Who are we kidding?
Yeah.
No. No.
It's a fear mongering lie that they've
Exactly.
literally sewn whole cloth. It's a joke. They're getting ready. They're getting ready for election 2024. Um, and expect to Trump will be called a Putin agent, a Russian agent. If you elect him, the very security of America is at stake. right?
Well,
You
I'll
know,
say,
they tell you that supporting Ukraine uh, is supporting American security interests, but they don't tell you how are they, like, how do they turn into security interests?
I'll tell the audience what I told you when I saw that statement. Trump says NATO is dead. Trump says he won't defend Europe if there's an Article 5 situation. Inshallah.
Mm. Mm.
It's that's all I can. That what more could you ask for than
Yeah.
the Americans trying to avoid World War III? And once again, we remove America from the equation fundamentally. While there are still some forces in Europe that would want that conflict, the chance of an open hot conflict between the Europeans and the Russians is decimated, to say the least. If you remove NATO and the Americans from the equation, now that's not to say that relations would be good, but they would be workable. They would
Hmm.
be pragmatic
Hmm.
if we were to eliminate that. Now, perhaps the European Union would be something of a stumbling block to that, but it would certainly be an improvement over what we have today if NATO were to up and die. And I I don't really think that anyone with any sort of sense can question that. And beyond now, look, perhaps at risk of making NATO sound more noble than it ever was, it had a reasonable goal in 1949, at least on the surface. But post 91, it has been we wanted to solidify the decline and destruction of Russia, and that was evidenced by the fact that we turned down their application. We did not allow them to join NATO because if it were truly moving into the 21st century, if it were truly moving to a new era, they would have continued on the path of reconciliation. And at that point, once again, come 91, NATO really had two options. It can either disband, realize it's an obsolete organization that has served its purpose, or at least its stated purpose, or it can adapt and it can meet the new challenge. But once again, they chose to continue walking in the same direction and, in fact, fomenting conflict where there did not need to be. Under what circumstances did Ukraine need to join NATO? Under what circumstances did the Baltic states need to join NATO? Romania, Poland. I mean, even if they did, say, Poland and the Baltic states and stop there, and even if some former Soviet bloc nations were to fall under NATO, that would have been tolerable. But once again, the moment they went for Ukraine is the moment that a bridge was burned between the West and Russia. And there's really
Yeah, they would basically want to repeat what they did with the communist revolution. That is America's, the Anglos, and their kosher friends. So when the Russian Civil War was going on right after the revolution, um, American forces showed up in Azerbaijan and Baku to secure the oil fields. The British were in Murmansk. They never sanctioned the communists. They never helped out the whites. What did they do? Right? They basically secured the assets. They bought up this stuff, and it's another example of capitalism working with communism. Um, and it's to, like, what they want is a repeat of that scenario. This is why they could never be brought into NATO, because ultimately what the Atlanticist powers wanted was to balkanize Russia, right? They were partly successful with the communist revolution. Um, Even in part, they were very successful. But it wasn't a beast that they could totally control. But it was a beast of their making. The biggest truck factory in the world was constructed by Ford in Donbass. All of this stuff was, I mean, Russia and Germany were really growing in the latter half of the 19th century. Um,
and they were on. They weren't. They were, by no means were they
they were on a
allies.
trajectory that threatened the British and the
Yes,
Americans,
and
and it
by no
and
means.
the animosity from their kosher friends um, was such that the three of them had this that had the same goal of destroying these countries.
Oh, absolutely. And to touch on that point, at the end of the 19th century, by no means were the Russians and the Germans allies, but especially under Bismarck's foreign policy, it
Hmm.
relations were kept on at least workable terms. And that really lasted. And actually, a few months back, I was reading Guns of August again, a fascinating book for anyone interested in World War I. And the preface to that is, I can't remember. I think it was Edward the Edward the Seventh, and that's probably wrong. But one of the former British kings who, at that point,
Yes,
the
who
country.
abdicated?
No, no, that was. I think that was George the
Yes,
Fifth.
you're right.
But
Yes,
the one I'm referring to, this is. I think he was immediately after Victoria. I think he was Victoria's successor. By that point, the British Crown was largely a ceremonial organization. The Parliament, the Prime Minister ran the country. But
that's right.
he fashioned himself as the chief diplomat of the country, and he went to France, he went to Germany, he went to Russia, and what he was trying to do is he was trying to build a continent-wide anti-German coalition, because at that point the mind of the British ruling class was, we have to take down the Germans. Now, once again, we've seen Salisbury, we've seen all of this. They wanted to coax the Germans and Russians into war with each other. First take down the Germans, then goes the Russians, and just collapse continental power as it was. Use the corpse of the French in order to accomplish that goal, because at that point France had been suffering a slow and steady decline, and the most recent of which being the Franco-Prussian War. But that was, I mean, and that was the strategy. He accomplished his goal, certainly, with the way World War I played out. He more than accomplished his goal.
Edward the Seventh.
Yes, thank you. Um, but that was the that, and I mean that's been the British strategy for centuries, preventing a continental power bloc from rising up. Not even a united continent, but a continent on good terms with one another, playing those rivalries against each other, because they fear, once again, if the power bloc of the continent is able to come to at least workable terms with one another, it ices out the Anglophone world. It makes them less relevant, because if the Russians or the French aren't concerned about their next war with the Germans, they're not going to turn to the British for an alliance. They're not going to turn to the British for help, in which case the British can demand all sorts of concessions. So once that leverage goes away, although the British by no means would have been destroyed, the leverage they lose with the other powers of the world evaporates. Once again, returning very much to basics, but I know there's a lot of people out there who still haven't really gone deep down this rabbit hole. I do think it's fascinating going back to the great game of the 19th century, etc. But once again, this goes back centuries, and this is just the latest iteration of it. America has assumed the mantle of the British Empire. As we saw after World War II, the British elite were very careful to manage the British decline by handing over the keys of the empire to Washington. We see the continent under a subjugation of the Anglo-American bloc, or the American bloc, or the American Empire, whatever you would like to call it, with, at the time, the Soviet Union, now these days Russia, as the only real challenger. And I've touched on this point many times. We saw in the early 2000s, especially after the Iraq War, when the U.S. did take a blow to its credibility, closer cooperation between Germany, France, and Russia. And that trajectory was continuing up until the Maidan. It it wasn't
Hmm.
the most fruitful of cooperation, but the seeds were there. The idea that they might form a cooperative bloc of nations, even if it isn't the strongest of alliances, it is still something that marginalizes the American Empire's influence on the continent, and that could not be allowed to stand. And that was what needed to be destroyed, which is what brings us to the position we are today. And the reason we've seen time and time again that those who run the Washington Empire, particularly the neoconservatives, did everything they could to isolate Russia, did everything they could to continue this rivalry with Russia even into the post-Soviet era, and why our relations are languishing today. Now, there were some forces, once again, I've discussed this before, that did want to continue down the path of détente, that did want to continue down the path of rebuilding some sort of relations. Some were,
Even George Bush
yeah,
Sr.
even George Bush Sr. Now, some were much more just pragmatic in terms of, we don't want to create a situation that's going to be unmanageable for us. Some were a lot more Machiavellian, where they were realizing what was at stake, and that we're going to pit the Russians against the Chinese, and they're going to bear the brunt of any future conflict or any future confrontation with the Chinese. And that's was one of the ideas that was floating around. But once again, what won out is the idea that we have to finish the destruction of Russia that started in '91 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And once again, the rise and the fall of the Soviet Union mirror each other in such a way. I don't want to say nice way because it paints too pretty of a picture for what the brutal reality was. But they're almost perfect parallels to each other in terms of what their goals were. And once again, both were to destroy that Russian power bloc because they brought in these communists, they brought in these Bolsheviks to try to tear it down. They succeeded for a time. What nobody anticipated is this Georgian bank robber would clear them out and restore some semblance of order and sanity despite the brutality. That system lasts for another 50 years. That falls apart. And then they find
And
themselves.
particularly, it accelerates in the 70s.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of Jews begin leaving in the 70s. Remember, Kissinger didn't want them. I think Kissinger, in his heart of hearts, wanted a détente with Russia. I think he's
Oh,
always wanted that,
absolutely.
and he didn't want them because I think for him, a deeper reading of Kissinger was if they come here, that's a signal that we're ready to do something extraordinary against the Soviet Union, right? Why aren't they content to stay there? They still kind of run the place. Although you're right, gradually, at the end of Stalin's um, tenure and thereafter, with some ebbs and flows, Russia had this like anti-Zionist um, museum or something. Like I remember walking past it. I've never gone in, but they had stuff that was as literally as anti-Semitic as anything that you've seen from the mid-century Germans, right? So, um, but that belies like with many of them were still in very high positions of
Yes,
power,
the
and
relationship between the Soviet Union, Zionism, and the Jews is much more complicated. Now, the early Soviet Union, when it comes to, yeah, they completely ran the place. Before Stalin came to power, they completely ran the place. There's no question about that. Stalin
yeah,
comes to power, gets hairier. I mean, but granted, mind you, Stalin is the first major world leader to sign off on the Zionist project. So there's that as
he
well.
is. And then when he doesn't get what he wants, then he goes after them.
Yes, and
And
then
he's not coming from like an anti-Semitic point of view where he wants to wipe them out. He knows where the leverage is, right? That's why he has a show trial. He executes 12 Soviet Jews in the Czech Republic to basically scare the West. Like, I'm going to kill a lot more of these guys if you don't let me have the nukes.
it was all power politics. It wasn't driven. I mean, who knew what his personal views were? I mean, judging by some of his personal comments, I suppose you could gauge that. But
I think his wife was Jewish,
yeah,
so
yeah. I mean, but it wasn't like the Germans where they had like a doctrinal and ethnic problem with these people. Once again, it was pure power politics. They knew where they stood. They knew that the fickle loyalties that they had, and that especially with the question of Zionism and the relationship with the West and the Soviet Union, that these weren't the most reliable power bloc, and that he was going to play them as much as they played him. And like I said, I'm just speaking purely from an analytical standpoint.
yeah,
No moral commendations or condemnations being put down here. But that's what happens. He thought Israel would be an ally of the Soviet Union. That didn't pan out. The Soviet Union pivoted towards the Arabs, especially post Stalin, moving into Khrushchev and especially Brezhnev.
uh-huh.
Very steadfast with the Ba'athist movements, with the Arab nationalist movements, big supporters of the '67 and '73 wars, and but by the '80s, the Soviet Union and Israel were on very hostile terms by the
Yeah,
'70s, by the '80s, and I mean, once again, you had the Soviet Union, which was on great terms with Syria, great terms with Iraq, uh, to an extent supported the Palestinian cause, had back and forth relationships with Egypt, but especially after the '67 war, found itself much more aligned with Egypt, one of the main arms suppliers to these Arab states. So, not to get off on too much of a tangent here, but you can see where all this really came together, and going back to just stringing this all together into the history of the Soviet Union, into modern Russia. It they were presented a choice, and they could have taken a very rational approach that would have required a short-term acquiescence of some of their power, and it would be comfortable. Relationships would we probably wouldn't be allies, but they would be relatively cordial. They would be on workable terms. But because of ethnic resentments and because of fear of losing hegemony, a newfound hegemony, this is the position we found ourselves in which case we've sacrificed everything and really haven't gained anything for it.
Yeah.
But I suppose with that tangent out of the way, the last thing on Ukraine is the most likely fate of Gonzalo Lira that was announced today. So
Hmm.
this is according to his father, Gonzalo Lira Sr., that Gonzalo Lira, who was arrested by the Ukrainians, I believe that was, what was that, in June, July?
He was arrested. The first time he went missing for about 2 weeks, or just under 2 weeks, something around there. In I believe April 2022. Then he was on house arrest for a long time. And then I think you're right. May or June, he was arrested again.
Because that's when he put out that video of him detailing everything that had happened and his attempts to try to escape Ukraine.
Oh yeah, when he yes, yes, yes. But he'd already. I mean, yeah.
And
I have no idea why he made those videos.
yes, and once again, we've discussed it.
Remember all the idiots who said he was an agent?
Yeah, I do. But when yeah, we've discussed them at length. We've talked about some of the strange things that have happened with that. But it is highly likely, if we're to believe the reports of his father, which we have no reason to disbelieve these, as far as I have seen, that he was sent to a prison camp and he worked until he got pneumonia and died. As of today, we have the death reports, and to this point, the U.S. State Department, the White House, had no comment on this beyond Biden's canned support of free speech, which you were telling me about.
Mm.
And this is what it has come down to. Once again, you can say whatever you want about this. Oh, he shouldn't have been spouting pro-Russian propaganda, blah blah blah, in Ukraine. Well,
Then just
regardless,
let him go. Kick him out. Let him go.
deport him, which is what they did to several other people. I mean, nobody that high profile, at least in terms of, I suppose. I suppose Lira wasn't exactly high profile as it was, but compared to the average person, certainly. But they could have very easily deported him. There's many options. This was somebody had a vendetta. Somebody wanted him eliminated. Perhaps these orders came from Washington themselves. I not that.
I don't think so.
No, I don't. I don't think so either. But I'm just saying that as a possibility.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but
We'll never know the.
we're talking about somebody at most who is an underhanded businessman who probably engaged in some immoral, if not outright illegal practices in Ukraine as well as many other places. But the idea that he is somebody that would warrant a backdoor assassination by Washington, I don't see the evidence for that.
Mm.
But there was some sort of pure spite here by whoever allowed this to happen, whether that be on the Ukrainian or the American side. And what I do think that no, the man's death is not justified. Certainly not. But I do think there are some things that we've seen from this, and that is to get the canned ones out of the way.
People who've done much worse have suffered nothing.
Oh, certainly,
And that'll be the case with Hunter Biden.
absolutely. Uh, I would just advise the average person not to engage in underhand business dealings in second world countries that are potentially in a political crisis. And when said political crisis breaks out, get out of there. And most importantly, what you should learn from this is that if you do get involved in any situation, even if it's completely above board, even if it's all good, all thumbs up, you did nothing wrong, the American government will not lift a finger to bail you out, especially if you have the quote unquote
Yeah.
wrong views. And that's the biggest thing. Whatever else you thought of the guy, like I said, I didn't know too much about him, but once again, weird
It
guy,
reminds me of the
smarmy.
J6 guys.
Oh, yeah, I can see
Like
that
people who
absolutely.
did like people who didn't even enter the Capitol, people who were like 22 miles away. Um, they're getting, anywhere from like 10 to 14, 4.5 years, like jail terms. But the guy who did the incitement, I forget his name. Um, he got 12 months and then he got out early on probation. Like, you know what I'm saying. It really makes you think. I mean, it's kind of, to be honest, it's kind of like what I think America is and has been for like definitely the last 8 years. It's another mask off moment. It's what they have planned for us. Yeah, that for me, that's where this fits in. Oh yeah, that's right. I forget his name, but anyways,
But there's really not much more you can say about it that hasn't already been said beyond the fact that
yeah, I don't know what kind of crazy shit he's done. Like I remember way back, even before Trump was elected. I watched a few of his videos on his channel. I didn't like. It wasn't particularly interesting. Now, I think after the war started, he did say some interesting things here and there. He also said a lot of crazy things. I mean, like I get the argument that he should have left. I get it, right? But this was just cruelty, and it's always the same kind of, the ones with that kind of Israeli mindset that are also on the right, you know, like they're just gleeful he's dead, like as if he did something personal to them. Like, what did he do? I mean, he didn't, he had a YouTube channel that was, I guess, semi-popular. You don't have to watch it. Like, but the reactions are like he did something personal to them. I, I mean, maybe he was a sex pest. Was he a worse sex pest than Jimmy Savile? I don't think so.
I mean,
I mean, a lot of this stuff we don't know for sure.
there's a million of these guys, like millions of these guys in the world right now, and once again, while you can't really commend them for their moral character in terms of what they're actually doing. In the grand scheme of things, it's not really that bad. It's not really then anything of note. The fact that, once again, at least from what I know about him, correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps I'm missing something here. The worst we're talking about is a smarmy businessman who ran his mouth too much. And like I said,
Yeah, yeah.
he paid the price for it, and not that I think he should have, by no means. But this is the worst we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody who has engaged in any sort of heinous crimes, as far as I know. And once again, it was petty, it was spiteful by whoever effectively signed his death warrant, and that
Hmm.
once again, I take no pleasure in this, and a take I saw going around, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is that there are many people, if they had the capability to do the same, would want to do the same to you and me, and I wholeheartedly believe that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
I agree.
like I said, even if it's for the most benign of purposes, if you're going to be abroad for any reason, and I don't think this needs to be said, especially to our audience, but I'll say just for the sake of putting it out there, do not rely on the American government to bail you out from anything. You
Yeah,
will you,
I
you
mean,
will
if
you will
you're
be
if you're a
spurned.
black lesbian who smokes a lot of pot, like you're gonna be okay. Yeah, you'll be okay.
Yeah, yeah, but if you're a normal person, don't rely on the State Department's
Hmm. Hmm.
protection. It won't get you anywhere.
Now, I do want to bring this up because I think in some ways it's related in terms of like who will be targeted, right? I'm just gonna send this to you. I've seen. not too many takes, but definitely not. Definitely not very good takes. So you remember this? Remember when this protest happened and the guy with tattoos all over his face? He actually went and fought against the Russians in Ukraine. So look at this narrative that they're building, right? Just before the election.
Yes, and this was the man who did the banner drop in the bridge in Florida.
Yeah.
And when during the interview they asked him what he thought about the election, and he was like, "Trump and Biden are both slaves of." I can't remember whether he said international
Yes.
Jewry, whatever, but I like Biden better because he's giving rockets to the Ukrainians. Heil Ukraine,
Yeah.
Heil Azov. I think not. Those were pretty much his exact words.
Right, right. I remember that. And then the whacked out guy with tattoos on his face was going like Slava Ukraini, right? So like, what do they do? They kept pace with these guys, they phoned them 4 months later. Hey, you guys still support Ukraine? I mean, it's nonsense, right? So they're now I think it's a very interesting narrative that they're crafting, right? America's extreme right wing is kind of losing faith in Ukraine. Did you guys know that they were on Ukraine's side before the shit libs were on Ukraine's side? Um, One of the things I heard in the Pete Quinones show, and he said this. It's really way out there, but he thinks they're going to more actively. It could be just because it's an election year that they're changing this narrative, right? You're supposed to believe these guys like change their minds. Um, they're going to try to craft a narrative where there's actually proof that Putin is actually more like Hitler than we thought. Fab. I'm just saying that's what he said, right? I'm not saying I believe that they're going to really carry it out to that extent where they're going to fudge numbers about how many Jews in Ukraine were killed by the Russians and all of this stuff. But when I saw this, that immediately brought me back to that show that he did. I forget the name of this guy. He's got his own podcast. I've never seen him before. And I immediately thought, like, yeah, they're going to try to craft this idea, maybe not to the extent that Pete described, but they're going to try to craft this kind of narrative that, the right wingers, you don't know this, but they've switched sides in Ukraine. And Trump is running for office, and you know, look at these guys. They don't support Ukraine anymore. They're supporting Putin. Trust us. I see that narrative developing. To what extent? To what depth? Like, how elaborate will the lies be? I don't know. But um, to some degree, it will be there. So I would say look out for that.
And that will be, once again, as you were touching at, all the more reason to delegitimize support for the war in Ukraine. And if they're desperate enough, they'll dig up that Trump was the first
Yeah.
president to authorize lethal aid to the Ukrainians as well,
You don't
and
want to
try
aid Ukraine? Are you a Nazi?
and try to put that, and then once again use his flip flop statements. But I you have to love the crafting of this image. They brought these people up, they gave them the one acceptable position, and then the one acceptable position they had, they threw them under the bus on.
Yeah.
And it does actually harken back. I remember back when they thought Ukraine wasn't going to go anywhere in 2018, 2019, they started to put out these articles criticizing the Azov battalion and the quote
That's
unquote far
right.
right in Ukraine. But those were all scrubbed the minute that the war broke out in 2022, and the and that they needed the support of these people, that they needed to cover this all up. They needed to make Ukraine look like a palatable cause for the left wing. But the the level of pivoting, I know we've touched on it before, that they're able to pull off is something that I honestly will always find remarkable. But that's really all the thoughts I have on all the items related to Ukraine. If you want to move on to some of the news out of
Yeah, yeah.
Poland, so in Poland, Tusk is newly in office. I believe this is his second or third week in office. Now, mind you, Duda is still president of Poland, and Tusk is using his newfound state powers to the fullest of their extent, where he has raided state media studios with employees who were put there, whether they be actual media personalities or those working behind the scenes, put there by Morawiecki's government, of course, on the more ostensibly right wing path, which has led to massive protests in the streets of Poland protesting against this. That Tusk is using his state power to purge the right wing from state institutions. Something you'll never see the inverse of, mind you.
Hmm, hmm,
Where,
hmm.
look, I mean, I actually don't want to give more Viki credit on anything because he was pretty impotent when it came to his right wing government, and Duda was much the same. There was some underlying anti immigration sentiment, some underlying anti leftist sentiment, to the credit of just the Polish electorate in general. But once again, once the so called moderate right fell out of power, that was evaporated. And so far, Duda has done nothing in his presidential authority to assist any of these people. And it does seem that Tusk is fully committed to clearing out any elements of, I guess, what many would call base Poland that have developed over the past 10 years, if we're being generous. And he'll continue that. And I do believe that with what they're trying to do, with what the new government in Poland is trying to do, that they're going to make it unpalatable for a right winger to ever effectively hold power in Poland again. And I think that was the goal from day one. I think they want to do the same to the rest of the European countries who have had a quote unquote right wing revolt. Hungary, they've been trying to get out for years, but Orban, to his credit, was able to actually use the state institutions to purge any of the rival left wing liberal power, shutting down Soros universities once again during his entire time in power. Neither Morawiecki nor Duda shut down anything related to Soros. Sure, they had the passing comments, but nowhere near enough. And we saw what the NGOs did the minute the Polish election happened. And Tusk is also fervent on supporting Ukraine, fervent on taking the bad deals that Ukraine gives them. Sure, there'll be some passing opposition, which related to the grain deal, related to
And
some
the
of the.
Green Deal is still the cancellation of the Green Deal is still there.
Yes,
It has
yes.
not been lifted.
Um, yeah, I'm glad to bring that up. But this is what we see with Tusk. I mean, his term starts out wonderfully with members of the right wing party extinguishing the Hanukkah menorah. Who could forget about that? And I guess this is vengeance. I guess this is what they get for aiding and abetting such an act. Not that anyone from PIS was involved in such an act. By no means would they have done something so brazen. But I I do think that this is what many of the European countries down the line have to look forward to. Having somebody exactly like Tusk coming into power and using every tool in the state against them. Now, hopefully the protests will have some pushbacks just for the sake of internal politics of Poland. I know I've criticized Poland to a great degree on this show, but by no means do I want to see their nation turned into an LGBTQ CIA rainbow colony. I really do hope the social sensibilities do prevail there, and I hope that the people on the streets are able to reverse some of this tide. I know that the protests aren't particularly over that, but that's what's on the horizon with the new government in power.
Now, I don't know how much you know about these these two MPs that were arrested,
I
right?
don't know very much about them. If you have more insight, I would appreciate it.
From what I understand, there's a law where so the charges are real, but there was a law. I don't know. There was some kind of a procedure that was enacted that prevented them from being arrested. I didn't fully understand the explanation, and quite honestly, I heard it too many days ago that I don't recall all the ins and outs. And so what I'm saying is these guys are not. It's not without any justification. Like it isn't because they said something, not that they didn't say something right wing, but it isn't because of that necessarily, if you know what I mean, right? Um, so yeah, I'm not making excuses for Tusk, obviously, right? But um, anyways, I'm sorry, I don't have any more I can say.
I mean, it's in terms of the case, it's still very much developing, so there's not too much you could dive deep in onto this. But I do think it's a sign of things to come in Poland, and I bring this up because it's something I want to keep track of in future episodes, and something I do want to return to because I imagine we will have more news out of this and more
Mm,
stories like this out of Poland as the current government does remain in power and as the screws of the European Union come down on it. Because all of the Polish resistance to the European Union on a legal, on an administrative level, are going to be peeled away, and I doubt Duda is going to lift a finger once again to support any of this. Sure, he can kvetch about it all he wants, but in terms of him actually exercising power against the will of the cabinet, against the will of the prime minister, judging by at least what I've seen from Duda's political career just from these past 2 years, I doubt we'll see any substantial action. Maybe token action, maybe enough to appease the right wing in Poland, but in terms of any progress Poland made in being an anti EU bastion, that has been wiped away. And like I said, I don't take any pleasure in saying that because out of all my criticisms, that's something I did actually like to see that they were standing stronger against the European Union, all the
mhm.
while being one of the larger recipients
We
of
were all
aids.
rooting for them.
But
Yeah.
once again, if you can milk every cent you can out of the bureaucrats, by all means, I completely support any country doing that. If once again, take out the system that takes from you. That's all. Legally, of course, and I wouldn't advocate anything illegal or anything fraudulent. Of course not. But within the confines of all the laws, rules, and regulations, and whatever else may apply. But like I said, I was certainly rooting for them in that sense. I hope that Hungary and other similar nations do not suffer the same fate, although it is always looming in the background. And I have to say, speaking completely frankly, I'm not optimistic for any of them.
Yeah, I'm not either. And you're right. There is this kind of mechanism like, the Empire Strikes Back. We're going to make right wingers pay.
They'll tie us all to Russia and convict us for espionage on
Yeah,
that. That
exactly.
it. I mean, I hate to imagine what Orban's future looks like if a color revolution ever succeeds in Hungary. They will put every charge they can against that man. That man will spend the rest of his life in a cell. They will
Mm.
full hammer. I mean, what the Israeli left tried to do to Netanyahu, not to sing the praise of Netanyahu by any means, they will do that and then some to Orban if they ever get the chance.
Hmm.
But that's all I had for the news in that regard. And I suppose the other major story that we've been sitting on, we should probably touch on before we lose the audience
Macron.
interest. Oh yeah. Oh, how could I forget about Macron? You know what? You were chomping at the bit to do this, so it's all yours. Tell our friends the wonderful news out of France.
So he is. Macron has is yeah. So he's appointed the new prime minister, um, Gabriel Attal, and Gabriel Attal is 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 everything that Macron wishes he could be: younger, gay, and Jewish.
Now let me tell you about why this is a base Jupiterian move.
Yes, do tell me where the Faustian spirit is hidden in this.
He's making Apollo proud every day.
He really is. You can't argue, obviously.
I mean, I just want to point out again, just returning to a story from last year. Barack Obama had a stronger response to rioters in countries than Macron did.
Yeah.
I need you to understand that
Mm,
Barack Obama, for everything that he was, had a stronger will against any sort of protests and riots than Macron was able to muster.
I mean, look at the just to give you an idea of how things have changed. Trump, Obama, Bush Jr., Bush Sr., Clinton, all of these guys were able to say the word ceasefire for Israel, but not Biden and not Blinken.
Even Trump, even Zion Don could say
Even
ceasefire.
Zion Dunn. They can't even say the word. They can't even say the word. And we were talking earlier. If that's what they have planned for them, what do they have planned for us? And this is what I mean. I see really stupid right wingers. Like oh, just be. I saw on Telegram there was some kind of an exchange.
Oh, I love Telegram
I don't know if it
exchanges.
was on Mark Colette's channel, but you have these guys. These guys are also the ones that are most likely to support Ukraine. And what they'll say something along these lines. Just shut up about Israel. Let them do what they have to do. Because when the time comes for us to do it, you know, we'll be able to do it. That's how naive they are.
Oh
Like the
no.
Ukrainians will defeat the Russians, and then America will just allow us to become like this, the largest army in Europe, battle hardened and totally right wing. Like it would make Poland blush, and it would make, Mongol Russia blush, right? In their heads, they think that's possible, and it's the same kind of stupidity that I see it all the time. It's such wishful thinking.
Yeah, but I'm just can't get over how Jupiterian appointing a young 37-year-old gay man to be your right hand man. This is what Apollo would have wanted. It's I what wonderful news out of France. I almost forgot about that. I'm glad you brought it up, but I do suppose with the last hour of the show here, we should get into some of the news about the Red Sea and the
Mhm.
U.S. UK strikes on Yemen last night.
Yep.
So the blockade continues, and the seizure of ships by the Yemenis continue. But last night there was a largely unannounced operation. I'm sure those of you who remember the Syria strikes remember Trump both times came out with a lot of song and dance, did a major speech on the targets he was striking, and really trying to sell it to the general public. But when it came to this, it was just reported that there were strikes on Yemen against Houthi positions.
Hmm.
And so far, what this looks like, it doesn't look like these strikes did much. But to remove any personal opinion, personal bias from what I'm about to say here, I don't know what exactly these strikes were trying to accomplish. And I have a theory why they were done and why they were done the way they were done. But in real terms, I cannot imagine what these actually accomplished. So we have a situation here where the Houthis in particular have been making the Red Sea impassable for parties that they deem to be supporting Israel. Once again, they've let Chinese ships through, they've let Iranian ships through, they've let Russian ships through the Red Sea. And in response, the US and the UK coordinate an effort where they're going to launch what one could call a strike of deterrence against the Houthis. In an
Hmm.
active crisis, they think that they can treat this as if it's 1994 Iraq, where there's no active combat, where there's no active political situation, where they can just lob a few missiles and bombs at a few targets to flex their muscles in the middle of an ongoing crisis, rather than actual strategic targets, rather than actual military response to what the threat at hand is here. Now, there's two reasons why they can't do that, despite the fact that on paper that's the most rational move for the US and the UK to have taken last night. And that is number one, the potential for retaliation, especially from allies of the Houthis, particularly the Iranians and the Iranian aligned groups in the region. The risk was too great there. We've already seen what's been happening to the American bases in Iraq and Syria over the past 3 months, and it's not been a pretty sight. It hasn't been mass casualty, but the strikes have escalated on these bases. And number two, we're in an election year. There's no room for major military moves in such a year, to the point where the most you can do is throw away those symbolic strikes. The most you can do is launch a few salvos in order to, quote unquote, scare the Houthis into submission. But once again, the blockade is still maintained. The blockade has not gone anywhere. It won't go anywhere. And I mean, after a certain point, you have to realize, even if the crisis is solved, even if there is some sort of at least temporary settlement to the issue with Israel, the Palestinian state in Gaza, who says these blockades won't continue? Because you've had this group figured out that they can alter world trade at effectively the flip of a switch. And they'll certainly, I would imagine, if there's any foresight, and I don't know, perhaps their Iranian sponsors will tell them to heal on this. But it does open up a massive point of leverage, and especially considering the fact that they know the West at this point is not going to commit to a full-scale military campaign, even an airborne campaign, to eliminate them. They have all the more reason to keep doing it, and they always have that threat in their back pocket if they ever need to activate that again. And it's really opened up a new dynamic that the so-called guarantor of the seas could not put together a coalition to combat such a threat to sea trade. And when they did manage to put together a coalition, it was between two nations pounding what were effectively empty targets. Now, while I think this strike was stupid, while I don't think it accomplished anything, I do think that a lot of the response from people who were against it, as I am, are a bit off base here. And to be fair, because of the recent crisis with Israel, with how much attention it has gotten, it has drawn in a lot of new eyes, a lot of people who weren't paying attention to this back in 2015, 2018. But I think what a lot of these people fail to realize, and I'm not even here to necessarily criticize them that much for it, is that this is nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to the Yemen conflict for the better part of the past decade. Because either directly or indirectly, whether we used our own warplanes, our own weapons, or got the Saudis and the Emiratis to do it, we've been launching strikes at Houthis positions for 10 years now, almost 10 years now. And that hasn't changed. It's ebbed and flowed. Intensity of such a conflict has changed. Obama had a massive aerial campaign, particularly with drones in Yemen. When Trump came into power, that was more delegated to the Saudis, and funding for that war was very controversial, especially after the Khashoggi incident. And then once we got into these past couple years, with the Chinese brokered détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, most of the military action in Yemen has stopped. I mean, we're at the point where the Yemeni government and the Houthis are effectively on the same page about Israel. And that I don't think it will shock anyone. But there's been almost an effective stop in the fighting where they've formed something of a unity government on this one issue alone. And that's also bolstered by the fact that Saudi Arabia is no longer an active participant in this war, nor are the Emiratis. And it's reported that when these strikes were conducted, that the UAE and Saudi Arabia declined to allow their airspace or any sort of aid towards these
Yes,
attacks,
I heard that
which
too.
is a major change in anything we've seen out of that. I mean, people want to focus on the escalation of this. People want to focus on the potential Israel Arab Muslim world conflict expanding. But I think the real point of significance here is the departure of Saudi Arabia on the issue of American foreign policy. I mean, this has been happening for years now, but this is the first time when it was put to trial by fire when the U.S. wanted to conduct a military operation in the region and did not get the consent of Saudi Arabia. Now, it went through anyway by alternative channels, but it was not given the green light by the Gulf states, which were, and any other time, up
Mm.
until a few years ago, reliably in support of any American military action in the region. And even if their governments didn't like it, just from the sake of needing to appease their sponsors in Washington, they would have allowed it to happen. But no, it has completely changed this time, where, I mean, mind you, this is the same Saudi Arabia led effectively, and I know he hasn't taken power fully yet, but led effectively by Mohammed bin Salman, who has spent the past several months, even before the recent Israel Palestine crisis, snubbing Biden in favor of meetings with the Russians, meetings with the Chinese, and meetings with the Iranians, at that matter. He's snubbed. A crown prince of Saudi Arabia has snubbed the U.S. in favor of Iran. This is a territory we've not been in since before 1979. And I mean, even then, the idea of the Saudis snubbing us in the 70s, beyond once once again the flare up in '73 notwithstanding, it was unthinkable because we're talking about the petrodollar, we're talking about the agreements that have been in place for the better part of 50 years at this point. In fact, I think actually over 50 years at this point. Those had all of those gains, all of that tedious work in order to secure that power structure has been wiped away just in the course of a couple of years. This is how much the American empire has tanked its credibility. And when people talk about, well, America's as strong as ever, of course, we're unchallenged. Look, we did these strikes on the Houthis. When you need strikes on empty deserts that may contain militants to prove your strength rather than the sheer threat of force, I mean, in any other time, if the Americans had the power that, say, they projected in the late 90s or early 2000s, the mere threat of a strike would have made any militant group back down over a potential blockade of such a vital trade route. That nothing else would have needed to have been said. The fact that we even had to go through with any kind of strike shows a diminishing of power. The fact that we actually have to use that power. I know it sounds a bit backwards, a bit in reverse, but that's how it stands. And once again, the fact that we had to get denied by the Saudis also
Hmm.
shows
Hmm.
a monumental shift in the balance of power in the region. And decades of progress, decades of diplomatic effort flushed down the toilet.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that are happening right now where, I said earlier they can't even say the word ceasefire. They literally can't even bring themselves to it. Nor the, of course, they're miles away from saying genocide, right? Um, and of course, this conflict in the Red Sea. I mean, I know people have argued that the Houthis were always going to do this. I don't believe that. Um, I think if there was, no atrocity on Gaza, it wouldn't have happened. I think it's leverage. I mean, you look at some of those posters those Houthis have, and they're naming them. They're how can I put it? They're much more blatant than even the Iranians are, and they've become kind of like superstars. Okay. Even the Iranians landed on a boat with their military helicopters, I think today or yesterday. Now, granted, it's a tit for tat with the Americans, and that's why they're doing it because there was a vessel that the Americans had seized. So but there are men in the thousands that are flocking to Yemen that look at it as a spearhead that can be used, right? That Yemen is very mountainous. It's not an easy place to target. Okay, so they'll target some of their installations for sure, but I mean the Saudis have been fighting these guys. When was it? Since 2016? Didn't their war start just about a year and a
Yeah.
half or 2 years after Syria, I want to say
Yes.
2014, something like that. Anyhow, um, so yeah, in the Muslim Arab world, these guys are rock stars. They love them, and they're going to go. There's going to be young men who are very idealistic, who are going to be willing to lay down their lives. Um, and they have completely disrupted global trade as a result, but I contend that they would not have done it if Israel had not behaved the way it is, and that too is America's inability to rein them in, right, is also a kind of a mask off and a kind of um, an ipso facto moment that America does not have um, the leverage it once did. Now, you could argue and say, well, Israel was always in charge, blah, blah, blah. I mean, I think that was a gradual process. And I think this is the first administration that clearly demonstrates that, right? Um, you know, a lot of these tunnel diggers, they feel pressured, and I think they're deciding that they're going to fight. They're going to if they have to burn America's reputation, so be it. And it reminds me of the what is it, the ICJ court proceedings that are taking place right now, right? Whatever you think of that court, right? Just understand it's a Western institution, and whatever you think of South Africa, a lot of legitimate criticisms. It's a dysfunctional country. Whatever you think of that, those are all secondary issues and do not approach the issue that we're talking about. And that is they've, as Alex Christoforou put it, they've done a checkmate move, and they have, right? If what is happening in Israel, right, uh, is not just matched with a verdict that confirms your lying eyes about what's happening, but but even tries to cloud that during these proceedings, right? And you wonder why Israel went along with this in the first place. They could have just ignored it. I mean, they do that a lot anyways, right? That in and of itself is interesting. But just to return to the point, if they exonerate the Israelis, then the court is a sham. And that will begin the process of the separation of the world with separate institutions, no longer one. And I've waited many years for this to happen, and I'm very happy it is happening, right? A separate UN, something that is analogous to it, whatever, for different regions. But that whole post World War II world, let it die.
Oh, absolutely. And like you said, whatever you think of the IJC, any of these organizations,
It's it
that
doesn't matter.
yeah.
From you know what this program is about. You know
Oh,
what like
exactly.
right? Like, don't get hung up on this secondary stuff. Think more
Exactly. Like
strategically.
everything that delegitimizes the UN is a good thing. I mean,
Yeah,
well, like I said, like I. I don't care that they want to do the third world Afro communism thing. Of course they do. They've been doing that since for 70 years now, and this is a shock to nobody. But if them and the Israelis want to be at each other's throats, that's less of them at my throat from either side of it, frankly. And the dumber the UN looks, once again, the better that is.
yeah,
This all-encompassing institution that has screwed over countless of nations and has really destroyed the world order and diplomacy as we know it. If that can get pissed on by some regional bloc, then I'm going to point and laugh all the way.
yeah. That's what's so great about this, is it delegitimizes it, and if you delegitimize the UN, you're going to delegitimize America. I've said this on this show for years, that the UN is America, right? Yeah, I even cited, what's his name, Charles Murray, the guy who experimented on Ted Kaczynski, you know, who was with that little blurb that I've read out once in a while about how, America is poised to become like the government of the world. Mm, I just remember all those years ago in the late 90s, and well, I didn't listen to him in the late 90s, but in the early 2000s, listening to Alex Jones going, back then it was more credible, but he would say things. So this is like 20 years ago. NATO is, there's going to be NATO troops here. It's like, what are you talking about, NATO troops? NATO, you own NATO. Like, it's your beef with your government. It's not like Europe. England isn't going to gang up with France and Germany to overtake it. It's not going to be like instead of Red Dawn, Blue Dawn with an EU flag. Like, get real. Like, you're so stupid. Um, so, anyways, I just think that stuff is so funny. Um, yeah, but so this more divided world, fractured world. Yeah, hopefully, hopefully that accelerates. And I think it is because they don't have a choice. Like, either Israel is found guilty, and that restores belief in American leadership, the whole mythology of American leadership. If it doesn't, then it's another example of a mask off moment. When they talk about how, well, yeah, Ukraine is willing to fight them to the end, to the last Ukrainian. And they almost say those words. That's a mask off moment, right? And America's had a lot of them, and even in internal politics since Trump's election, you have so many mask off moments. So, these tensions and these fractures were always there, and now, like, they just can't abide by them anymore. They have to say it. That's how critical things have become. So, yeah, that's where we are.
Absolutely, and it's. I mean, while I do recognize the very real implications this has, and that life will probably become more difficult just on every level, I, at risk of sounding callous, these are band-aids that need to be torn off because this system is unsustainable. It's not doing us any benefit, and
No.
that and even people who I would ostensibly disagree with and would prefer to have nothing to do with, just on an average level, it's not doing them any credit either. There's only a very small
Hmm.
amount of people that this system is actually working for. And
Like, do people understand? I'm sorry to cut you off, but
no,
do
go ahead,
people
go ahead.
understand if Israel gets away with this? Like, if you're coming from a Christian perspective, right? We're Orthodox Christians. If they get away with this, right, they're not going to stop there. They're going to, like, there are, you know, bills, proposals by Jews in Florida who want to alter the New Testament because there's parts that they consider anti-Semitic.
And
They define that meaning, right? Like, if you let them win in Palestine, this is like it's going to embolden them. It's not the Russians that are going to invade Poland because they managed to hang on a strip that, like, connects them to Crimea, right? These people will be emboldened and go for more, right?
and frankly, I might be a little out of my depth here, but I'm glad you have brought up the thing about Israel being bolden because one of my genuine concerns in all of this. Some may say this is outlandish, this is ridiculous, but I have to be honest. This is a genuine concern of mine. If the Israelis get their way, if they do get the complete cleansing of Gaza and the West Bank, they will build the third temple, and it's going to get
Oh yeah.
things are going to go very much downhill from. I mean, once again, I think we all know what that implies here, but
Hmm.
once again, perhaps I'm speaking on my because it's going to happen eventually. We all know that, but I
You know what they're going to do with Poland? We've been talking about Poland.
oh, absolutely,
It'll be resettlement. We
yeah.
lost all this, because when Poland was communist in the Warsaw Pact, in 1967, they just kicked out almost the entire population. How did they get away with that? Right? And but of course they'll tell you it's just theoretical. What if? Um, no, no. If they win there, they're going to go for more victories because some of them are genuine. We're genuinely shocked by Hamas. But the fact of the matter is, most of the civilians that were killed, particularly at that Nova concert, those were Israelis. The Israelis killed them with Hellfire missiles or whatever missiles their attack helicopters use. But that's what's coming for us if they win,
Oh,
right?
absolutely, and that's not to mention the fact that the Palestinians that are expelled and the other reverberating effects from this, the people who have to leave the region, where do you think they're going? They're not
Yeah.
going to Egypt. They're not going to Saudi Arabia. They're not going to any of the neighboring Arab states. Uh, they're heading westward. They're already negotiating resettlement deals with countries like Germany. They've pushed time again for Spain and Greece to open the ports to the displaced Palestinians. And it's not going to stop at that. If you genuinely believe in some of the more ambitious claims, we'll call them, of the hardline Zionists, they truly do believe in from the Tigris to the Euphrates. They want everything in between that.
Yeah.
And like I
Hmm.
said, now how widespread that actually is in Israel, I don't know, but there are elements who do want that, and even if it doesn't go that far, they're going to push for more expansion, whether that be into Jordan, whether that be into Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, be,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they're not going to stop at Gaza and the West Bank. And the more people that pour out, the more that are going to end up there, either because they're expelled or because they're refugees from a war that's being fought. I mean, there's even talks of the Zionists wanting control of Cyprus, of all
Y-
places. But
Yes. Yes. Yes.
they,
You,
they're
you know, one of the things that um, Father Raphael Matthew Johnson pointed out was, you know, the accounts, particularly those that were cited by Solzhenitsyn, but there's other articles that, you know, not written by him, but you know, I don't know if people know this, but the pogroms, you know, these areas that were predominantly Jewish, they were quite wealthy. They had their own arms. It was very hard to enforce gun laws. They attacked Orthodox Christians. They attacked um, them on Easter processions. There was one incident where 25 were killed. Like, you know, your great grandfather went to a pogrom, but you don't tell us why he went. So, and a lot of them, Zionist or, you know, Hasidic, believed that, like, if they destroy the Tsar and everything, they go back. They will go to Israel and wait for the Messiah. It's an inevitability, right? That's their perspective. Now, of course, we don't. It doesn't speak for all of them, obviously, um, but there are a good deal of them. You know, they don't want to have to mask what, you know, BC and AD mean with BCE and all these other half measures. They would rather that whole event for them be erased, right? Which is why they want to erase Christendom, and which is why Russia is a danger to them, or they perceive it as a danger.
yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's really much more I could add to that, but I I find myself towards the end of one of these episodes once again looking at all of this where the situation is continuing to spiral out of control. And
Hmm.
as once again, I can talk about the collapse of the American Empire all day, which I do think is happening, and I do think is a welcome development, just in terms of what I've gone over before. That this does have to come down one way or another. That will still have profound and reverberating consequences for the entire world, and that it will be a very hard transition, and what comes after it might not necessarily be an improvement. But once again, we're at a system that clearly doesn't work, so something else must be done, or else this is going to continue until it gets to apocalyptic levels. Now, fortunately, I don't think we're there yet, but just many of the things that we've discussed this episode in particular, as well as many other episodes over the past couple years, do see the very real possibility of something like that happening, especially
Hmm.
with all the vectors of escalation we were talking about in Ukraine, the amount of things that could go wrong or go right, depending on who you ask, that we're put in a very precarious situation, and there's not too many ways out except forward, and you can really only hope that those who are trying to turn this into a wider conflict, whether that be in the Middle East, whether that be in Europe, are stifled in their goals, because I don't want to see that. I don't think the world is prepared for the profound amount of death and suffering that would come from that. And once again, I'm not even trying to be hyperbolic here. I'm not even trying to exaggerate the situation here. I mean, what we're talking about is major conflicts that we have not seen in at least a century. At least a
Yeah.
century. World War II, if you want to be generous, but I do
Yeah.
believe,
80
yeah,
years,
80
let's say.
years. Even though I think it would be fundamentally different in form than World War II, but cataclysmic events that, especially with modern technology and the way war is conducted now and likely will be conducted in the near future, consequences I don't think that we will be able to bear as a people, as humans. Look at the toll that World War I did to us on a civilizational level, just across the world, not just the West, but across the world. There are still things that we cannot process from those wars just because
Mm.
of what they entailed, and I fear what a third go around at that would look like. And in many ways, I fear that it is inevitable, and some may wonder, well, why do you even do this in the first place? And not that I ever thought the show was going to make a great difference in the world, but I, I just do like to have just these thoughts on record, and I'm glad that others can enjoy them and take something away from them, and that if there is anything to recover from the ashes, that hopefully this helps the future understand. That might sound, a bit up my own ass. Perhaps it is, but I'd like to think that we're witnessing monumental events, and these are things that even if we don't have a solution, even if we don't have a quote unquote hot take, these are just things that need to be discussed for all of our own good.
Yeah,
But
I concur.
I suppose those are all the topics that I had on record, unless you had any last minute things, any last minute surprises for us.
Well, there was a potential conflict, two things, potential conflict around Myanmar with some, but that's been settled. Um, the whole thing with Venezuela and what was the other country that's been settled. I know we
Guyana.
didn't. Yes,
Well, once again,
and
these minor border disputes that went completely off our radar because of how monumental everything else has been lately.
they were resolved.
Yeah.
And Milei now, uh, Argentina has overtaken Venezuela in inflation without sanctions on it.
But isn't that just an Argentinian tradition?
Yeah,
I don't know. Every
I
every time
guess.
every time I hear anything about the Argentinian economy, just for the past 10 years, of which I can remember, is just massive inflation. That's all that I ever hear out of that country.
I know.
And to think that Argentina was supposed to be the last bastion that we could all flee to and become ranchers in, I don't think that's happening.
No.
But I don't know. It's a very nice countryside from what I understand. Uh,
Yeah.
but I yeah, that not that I expect anything serious out of any Latin American politics. I've just given up on that at that point. At this point, there's a reason the show is so unfocused on Central and South America, because in terms of, not that these countries are insignificant, but in terms of global influence, they're dwarfed even by Africa.
Oh, you know what? As long as we're talking about South Africa, the stuff that's happening in Ecuador, and Ashton Carrillo or whatever that thing is, blamed the Russians. This is just, and he or it was at the border, and the Mexican U.S. border, and it was I think claiming that the Russians are behind this and Russian sleeper cells are getting in. Yeah, fevered dreams.
Once again, Russia is both the weakest and the strongest it's ever been. It can't win a war in Ukraine, but it can infiltrate every government in every
Yeah,
stretch of the world.
yes,
It,
paradoxical.
I mean, but in all seriousness, in terms of Russian intelligence capabilities, not that they're not capable of infiltration, but in terms of them just being able to go in and wreak havoc in a Latin American nation, I think those days are honestly past Russia, and I do think that their strategic goals align much differently. Sure, there's the whole Venezuela thing where they're getting very cheap oil and gold from Maduro's government because of the circumstances down there. But in terms of deep Russian, or I suppose back then would have been Soviet meddling in Latin America, it's just Cold War boomer fantasy at this point.
Yes, it is.
And it's these people who still wish Reagan was president who just haven't gotten over the 80s, and that's what I think so much of America comes down to these days. In which case, everything else can go to hell if I can still pretend I'm living in the 80s. That seems to be the mindset of a large amount of the politically aware American public. And I don't know, maybe one day the delusion will be broken, but I'm not optimistic about that. But I suppose the news will carry on.
Yeah.
There'll probably be more events. Of course, if anything major happens, we'll come back sooner. But we'll see you next week, probably, just depending on
Hmm.
the news cycle. And until then, have a good one.
Yes.
So,
Take care,
thank
guys.
you everyone for tuning in, and goodbye.